Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're exploring some of the most ruthless and unpredictable women ever to wear a crown, the maniacal queens of history. Who were they, and what drove them to such extremes? Were they brilliant strategists, cruel tyrants, or simply products of the brutal worlds they lived in? We'll step into the palaces and courts of queens like Ranavalona of Madagascar, Wu Zetian of China, Irene of Athens, Mary Tudor of England, and even the blood-soaked legend of Elizabeth Bathory. Each of them left behind stories of power, ambition, and at times, sheer terror. Their reigns show us what happens when authority and obsession collide. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're winding down, getting ready to drift into sleep, or just here to hear some unsettling but fascinating history. I'm glad you've joined me. Now, let's begin. Across recorded history, the office of queen has never been a single thing. It has been a coronet and a command, a marriage contract and a ministry, a sanctuary and a scaffold. In different eras and places, the title has meant queen regnant who rules in her own right, queen consort who shares influence by proximity to the crown, queen regent who governs for a child, queen mother who guards a dynasty, and still other forms such as the Kandake of Kush or the pharaoh queens of ancient Egypt. The variety matters because it shows how a woman at the apex of a state could be both indispensable and impermissible at the same time, invited to reign when circumstances required, and condemned for the very fact of authority when those circumstances passed. The political grammar that made queens possible also made them perilous. In early medieval Europe, the Frankish Salic law, first set down in the 6th century and reworked in later centuries, discouraged or barred female succession and became a weapon in later disputes from the 100 Years' War onward. In England, the common law and custom allowed a woman to inherit when male lines failed, which is why Mary Tudor could claim the throne in the year 1553 and Elizabeth Tudor in the year 1558. In Iberia, the crowns of Castile and Aragon recognized the rights of heiresses in ways that produced queens who were sovereign in law, as with Isabella in the year 1474. And later her daughter Joanna in the year 1504. Across Eurasia, the Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven legitimated a sovereign by cosmic favor, yet imagined rulership in male terms, which is why the single woman to rule as emperor, Wu Zetian, was remembered with such unease by later Confucian historians. In Africa, matrilineal systems such as those of the Akan gave queen mothers decisive say in succession, while in the Nile Valley the queens of Meroe, among them Amanirenas in the late 1st century before the Common Era, commanded armies and negotiated with Rome on nearly equal terms. The material tools of queenship were as concrete as coin and as subtle as reputation. A queen consort in Western Europe drew income from her dower lands, an estate portfolio that could span counties and ports. Through those rents she hired servants, rewarded followers, endowed churches, and bankrolled factions. She intervened at royal councils, sat on judicial progresses, and stamped her authority on charters that carried a signet bearing lilies, or leopards, or eagles. Diplomacy traveled through her body and name. Dowry treaties connected dynasties across frontiers, which is why the Habsburg marriage network of the 15th and 16th centuries turned brides into living treaties from Burgundy to Castile. In the Ottoman court, the Valide Sultan became the principal broker of the imperial household, commanding household officers and the education of princes. In China, empresses and empresses' dowager managed palace ministries and the all-important flow of memorials, a bureaucracy within the bureaucracy staffed by eunuchs and ladies who controlled proximity to the throne. The ideological tools were liturgical and literary. In Latin Christendom, the anointing oil that sanctified kings could also sanctify a queen, as happened with Mary Tudor in Westminster Abbey in the year 1553, binding her authority to the same rite that had crowned her father. Iconography did similar work. Hatshepsut in the 15th century, before the Common Era commissioned reliefs that showed her in the traditional regalia of a male pharaoh, not as pretense, but as a theological claim that kingship was a divine office beyond the body. In the 11th and 12th centuries, queens like Matilda of Scotland and Urraca of Leon wielded the language of piety and lineage to author charters where their names stood alone, a written declaration that kingship could be grammatical in the feminine. Yet words cut both ways. Monastic annals, court histories, and pamphlets authored by men often framed forceful queens as unnatural, heretical, or unstable, so that the accusation of madness or lust became a routine instrument of politics. War and succession crises pressed hardest on women who ruled. When an heir was a child, regency opened a window for mothers to govern and rivals to conspire. In Constantinople, the Empress Irene used the machinery of court and church to defeat iconoclasts in the year 787 and then, a decade later, to remove her own son from power through blinding, seizing the title of emperor rather than empress. In Castile and Aragon, the death of Isabella in the year 1504 elevated Joanna to the throne, while her father Ferdinand and her husband Philip staged a contest to rule in her name, a struggle that turned on whether she could be declared unfit. In England, the brief usurpation that crowned Lady Jane Grey in the summer of 1553 collapsed when Mary raised the country in her favour, a reminder that legitimacy could be a living force in towns and shires, as well as a lawyer's argument at court. Courts gave queens instruments of mercy and instruments of fear. They could patronize universities and monasteries, as Maria of Portugal did when she created new learned institutions in Lisbon in the year 1779, but they also commanded prisons and pyres. Mary Tudor, intending to reverse the Reformation, restored heresy statutes and presided over roughly 300 burnings between the years 1555 and 1558. In Madagascar, a generation later than the American and French revolutions, Ranavalona, the first revived ordeal by poison, and drove missionaries from her island kingdom as part of a policy of sovereignty that protected independence at a terrible human cost. In Transylvania, the Countess Elizabeth Bathory was tried by commission in the year 1611 after hundreds of depositions described tortures and murders inside her castles. Whether monarch or magnate, a woman who claimed the right to punish like a king triggered a special horror in the public imagination, and that horror magnified every rumor into a legend. Religion cast long shadows across these stories. The doctrine that a ruler must defend the true faith legitimized persecution when the sovereign believed conscience required it, and invited pamphleteers to judge the ruler's soul when the people recoiled. Mary Tudor believed the burnings would save souls and heal an alliance with Catholic Spain. Wu Zetian recruited Buddhist prophecy to underwrite her accession and reformed examinations so that new men loyal to her would fill the bureaucracy. Irene convened a council to restore images even as she pruned her palace of enemies. Ranavalona fused ancestral tradition, royal ritual, and a politics of expulsion to define Malagasy identity against the encroachments of Europe. In every case, belief and power were less separate spheres than joint engines that drove policy. Geography mattered because it dictated both the threats a queen faced and the resources she could deploy. Cleopatra in Alexandria measured her chances against Roman legions and grain fleets. Zenobia in Palmyra gambled on desert cavalry and caravan tolls to carve a short-lived empire in the 3rd century of the Common Era. Margaret of Denmark used ships, guilds, and marriage to forge the Kalmar Union in the year 1397. Joanna's Spain stretched from the Atlantic to the foothills of the Pyrenees and, under her son, across an ocean. Maria's Portugal would evacuate the Braganza court to Rio de Janeiro in the year 1807 to escape Napoleon, an extraordinary reversal that made a European monarchy rule from South America. Ranavalona's highland capital at Antananarivo commanded rice terraces and forest routes to the coasts where British and French merchants calculated profits and pretexts. The label maniacal needs caution. Some women in the chapters ahead committed acts that meet any ordinary definition of cruelty or tyranny. Some were subject to insinuations designed to break their legitimacy. The same gesture that reads as cold statecraft in a king becomes evidence of unnatural temperament in a queen when the chronicler wishes it so. The historians who shaped posterity had their own commitments and anxieties, and this is not simply a footnote in the archive, but a force that structured fame and infamy. Still, archives also preserve hard things. Orders were written, bodies were burned, prison doors were locked, and kept locked for years counted in decades. The task is to read both the paper trail and the legend, to reckon with how power worked and how stories about power were made. A final point belongs to time. From the 15th century before the Common Era in Egypt to the 19th century in Madagascar, the repertoire of rulership changed as states grew more bureaucratic and empires spanned seas. Yet certain patterns endured. Marriage remained a treaty. The household remained a government. Religion remained a sword and a shield. Queens rose because dynasties frayed, because sons were infants, because husbands died, because a gate captain or a chamberlain chose a side at midnight. They fell because factions learned to count votes in council, because cousins learned to sign manifestos, because sailors learned to follow new flags. Between those rises and falls lie the stories of the women in this book, whose reputations were forged in blood, prayer, rumor, and law. Historians and pamphleteers have never agreed on what turns a queen from a sovereign into a monster. The language itself is treacherous. Tyrant enters the record when a ruler breaks custom and crushes rivals. Yet custom is a moving target set by the people who write the rules. Madness appears when behavior is judged against ideals of womanhood, yet those ideals change with the age. Between the accusation and the archive lies a space where rumor hardens into memory. The chapters ahead move through that space with care, testing legend against law and testimony against context, because the women in question earned their reputations in different ways and under different pressures, and because the words applied to them often tell us as much about their enemies as about their deeds. Take the case of the woman who dared to sit upon the dragon throne. In the late 7th century of the Common Era, in the capital at Luoyang and the old seat at Chang'an, a former concubine named Wu Zetian climbed the latticework of court to become the only woman to rule China as emperor in her own name. Confucian scholars, writing in the generations after her death, saw a cosmic order with the sovereign as father of the people. A woman who called herself emperor violated that order and was therefore described as a usurper by nature. The charge made political sense for her critics and moral sense for their readers. Yet the record also shows a ruler who expanded examinations to recruit talent beyond the aristocracy, who printed Buddhist sutras that aligned prophecy with her accession, and who stabilized a great empire after years of faction. Her severity is not in question. Purges occurred, spies were rewarded, nobles perished. The question that follows her into every library is whether those acts exceed what a 7th century strong king would have done, or whether the memory of a woman in that office threw a harsher shadow than similar conduct by a man. In Constantinople, 2 decades after Charlemagne was crowned in the West, the word tyrant came bundled with the word mother. Irene of Athens ruled first as regent, then as co-sovereign, then alone. She is honored in church history for assembling bishops at Nicaea and restoring the veneration of icons in the year 787, a decision that shaped the piety and art of the Eastern Roman Empire. She is condemned in political chronicles for ordering the blinding of her own son in the year 797, a deed that cleared her path to be recognized not as empress, but as emperor. Her reign was short after that, and she fell to a palace coup in the year 802. To Western eyes, her presence at the apex helped justify the coronation of Charlemagne as emperor in the year 800, on the theory that a woman could not be the rightful Roman sovereign. Here, theology and realpolitik intertwined. The charge of monstrous ambition masked the scramble of courts to define legitimacy. Irene's story forces readers to weigh a council's piety against a mother's violence, and to mark the point at which the need to govern became the excuse to erase a son. Not all reputations were built on deeds. Some were built on diagnoses. In Castile and Aragon at the turn of the 16th century, the Princess Joanna inherited a double crown when death thinned the line of succession. Her father Ferdinand, a veteran king, and her husband Philip, a Habsburg prince bent on enlarging his own power, competed to speak and act in her name. Accusations of instability began early and proved politically useful. The image that traveled through Europe was that of a queen who followed her husband's coffin across the winter roads of Castile, unable to surrender the dead to the grave. That tale may carry a kernel of truth, and carries the odor of propaganda as well. Privy Council memoranda, ambassadorial dispatches, and the cold signatures on confinement orders tell a second story of a woman neutralized so that men could rule. The confinement lasted year after year in the palace at Tordesillas, through the regency of her father and into the majority of her son, the future Emperor Charles. Here the label mad served as a constitutional instrument. If a queen could be declared unfit, her body could still anchor legitimacy while her voice was silenced. Religious violence carved its own channel through memory. Mary Tudor, eldest daughter of Henry and Catherine, reached the throne of England in the summer of 1553, with deep popular support as the rightful heir. She sought to restore communion with Rome, and did so with laws that revived the crime of heresy. Between the autumn of 1555 and the autumn of 1558, roughly 300 Protestants were burned in English towns, from Oxford and London to Colchester and Canterbury. The most famous of these martyrs was Thomas Cranmer, the former archbishop whose earlier decisions had helped unmake Mary's own legitimacy. The burnings were meant to cauterize schism. Instead, they branded her reign. Within a few years, John Foxe published Acts and Monuments in the year 1563, a vast gallery of Protestant suffering that fixed the name Bloody Mary in the language of the realm. The book was placed in parish churches for generations. It is impossible to read Mary's policy outside of that publishing revolution and the confessional struggle that followed. A queen's conscience and a printer's press combined to make a legend that outlived both. Some women earned their notoriety not as sovereigns, but as lords of blood within their own domains. In the hills of Upper Hungary and Transylvania, a century after the Reformation began, Elizabeth Bathory, a countess of a great family, faced a royal commission that gathered hundreds of sworn statements of torture and murder within her castles. The depositions describe instruments and methods so cruel that later centuries could hardly believe them without recasting them as Gothic legend. The claim that she bathed in the blood of virgins appears nowhere in the legal record of the time and belongs to folklore, but the consistent testimony of servants and neighbors persuaded authorities to seal her away in her own fortress. No queen sat in judgment there, yet the power she exercised looks like kingship in miniature. She commanded officers, controlled prisons, and dispensed punishment at will. That is what makes her a useful counterpoint in this book. A noblewoman who wielded near total authority within walls could attract the same accusations of monstrous appetite as a monarch, and a state that depended on noble houses could prefer a quiet bricking up to a public trial that embarrassed a whole order. The boundary between zeal and cruelty can be harder to draw when faith and sovereignty are woven together with fear of outsiders. In the central highlands of Madagascar in the early 19th century, Ranavalona the first took the throne in a contested succession and vowed to keep foreign hands off the island. She expelled missionaries, banned Christian rites, revived ordeal by poison, and set punishments that chilled subjects and visitors alike. European travelers recorded scenes of men and women hurled from cliffs and of labor levies driven to death in the forest and the heat while building roads and palaces. Some numbers in those accounts are doubtful or polemical. Others are repeated by independent witnesses and Malagasy sources. What is not in dispute is that the court she built tried to erect a fence around a kingdom facing the ravenous pressures of trade and empire, and that it did so with measures that cost countless lives. The point in this chapter is not to weigh policy in a modern court. It is to show how the label Mad Queen contains both a fact of terror and a story told by those whom she opposed. Madness returns in the story of a Portuguese sovereign whose tragedies were both personal and public. Maria the first began as a conscientious ruler in the year 1777, and then entered a decade of bereavements. Her husband died, her eldest son died, her confessor died. The French Revolution unfolded across the borderlands of Europe, and the execution of a queen in Paris terrified courts that had believed in the sacredness of anointed heads. By the year 1792, physicians who had treated the British king were asked to attend to the Portuguese queen. The advice and the bleeding and the cold baths did not restore her. Her son João took the reins of government as Prince Regent. When Napoleon's army crossed into Portugal in the year 1807, the royal family fled across the Atlantic to Rio de Janeiro and ruled from there. In Brazil, the queen remained a figure of devotion and sorrow, heard sometimes at night singing hymns or crying out in terror. Her case shows a realm building a humane regency around a broken mind rather than inventing charges to break a sound one, and it shows how the vocabulary of madness could mark both a political weapon and an honest diagnosis. Across these cases, the sources differ in kind and in temperature. For Wu Zetian, the principal records are dynastic histories compiled under male editors who wrote with moral missions. For Irene, they are Byzantine chronicles that traffic in palace whispers, beside accounts of councils and wars. For Joanna, the bulk is chancery paperwork, ambassadorial letters, and the careful fictions of courtiers who needed her to be present and absent at the same time. For Mary, the most widely read text was a martyrology that taught a nation to remember fire. For Bathory, the core is a stack of depositions and the silences imposed by a sentence of perpetual confinement. For Maria, the reports of physicians and ministers and the journals of an exiled court trace grief and decline. For Ranavalona missionary journals, Malagasy chronicles, and consular dispatches jostle and contradict one another, demanding that the historian test each claim against the others and against the hard facts of policy. What then shall count as maniacal in a book that aims to be fair? The threshold used here is simple and demanding. First, the woman in question must have been represented by contemporaries as cruel, unstable, or monstrous. Second, there must be evidence in the record of decisions or deeds that inflicted extraordinary harm or that were perceived as extraordinary by those who lived under them. Third, the narrative must examine the ways in which gender expectations sharpened the charge, either by making a normal instrument of sovereignty appear unnatural in a woman's hand, or by magnifying rumor into certainty when the subject was female. This is not a courtroom, it is a study. The aim is to set each queen against her political world with its laws and enemies, and then to measure the legend that rose around her. Where the archive is silent, we will say so. Where numbers vary wildly, we will trace the spread of those numbers and explain why some persisted. A final word belongs to the geography of reputation. Ideas moved along roads and sea lanes as surely as armies did. In England, the printing houses around St. Paul's and in Strasbourg and Geneva poured out pages that made policy into parable. In China, scholar officials taught future scholars how to read the previous age, and that syllabus fixed Wu's memory for centuries. In Iberia, the ceremony at a convent in Tordesillas replaced a queen's public with a circle of guards and confessors, leaving few witnesses and much rumor. In Madagascar, journals that began as missionary appeals in Europe hardened into the standard account of a queen for readers who would never see the island. These channels matter. They remind us that power and the stories told about power are twin institutions. The women in this book ruled palaces and ministries. Their enemies and allies ruled paper. In the chapters that follow, readers will move from Luoyang and Chang and to Constantinople, from Burgos and Tordesillas to London and Oxford, from the Carpathians to Lisbon and Rio de Janeiro, from the scarps above Antananarivo to the cliff paths of the eastern coast. The dates will march across a millennium. The themes will recur. A mother will act as a minister will act as a jailer. A church will anoint and then denounce. A state will print and then remember. The question asked at every stop is the same. What did she do? What did they say she did? What did the doing and the saying make together? The story begins in the heartland of the North China Plain, where river silt nourished peasant fields and the roads to Chang and Luoyang braided together the commerce of an empire. In the early 7th century, the Tang dynasty rose from civil war to build one of the most accomplished states in the pre-modern world. In this landscape, sometime around the year 624, a girl named Wu Zhao was born in a family of middling but rising means in what later sources place near Wenshui in Bing province. Her father, Wu Shiwo, prospered as a timber and horse merchant and then as a military officer who backed the founding Tang house. Her mother, Lady Yang, moved her daughters through the literate culture of the time. Unlike many girls of her generation, Wu Zhao learned to read and to write, to appraise verse and to quote history, skills that would matter in a court where poetry could serve as both ornament and weapon. The Tang court she would enter as a teenager was a school of power. Emperor Taizong, the second Tang sovereign, ruled from Chang'an, a planned capital of wide avenues, market wards, and rectilinear walls set against the Wei River and the Qinling Mountains. The court drew embassies from the steppes, monks from India, Sogdian traders from the oases, and artisans from every prefecture. In this cosmopolitan city, Wu Zhao was selected to the harem as a low-ranked concubine in her early teens, likely in the later 1340s by the Western calendar, though Chinese sources write in reign years. She would have learned the protocols that governed the women's palace, the rhythms of audience and banquets, and the careful arts of being noticed without appearing to seek notice. She was intelligent, bold in conversation, and, as later chroniclers concede, even when hostile, memorable in presence. When Emperor Taizong died in the year 649, the palace custom required that certain concubines take vows and retire to a convent. Wu Zhao was sent to Ganye Temple. What followed reveals a talent for reading the hinge moments of a dynasty. The new emperor was Gaozong, Taizong's successor and son. Gaozong visited the convent. He remembered the young woman who had served his father, and she remembered the prince who had become the son of heaven. Within a short time she returned to the palace, officially as a consort to the new emperor. In a court that prized ritual precedent, this return was remarkable, and it set the stage for a partnership that would change China. Wu Zhao advanced not only by charm but by mastery of the administrative world that orbited the throne. She cultivated allies among the scholar officials who staffed the 6 ministries. She studied the exam essays and memorials that flowed into the palace, and she learned the balance between the palace bureaucracy and the outer bureaucracy that ran counties, granaries, and armies. She also learned the power of ritual theatre. In the year 666, she appeared at Mount Tai with Emperor Gaozong for the solemn Feng and Shan sacrifices. These rites, last performed by Han emperors centuries earlier, proclaimed cosmic legitimacy. The empress's visible role in them hinted at the scale of her ambition and at the comfort Gaozong had in sharing the stage of sovereignty. That comfort deepened as Gaozong's health faltered. Starting in the later 660s, the emperor suffered debilitating headaches and episodes that left him unable to conduct audience. In these intervals, Wu acted as co-ruler. The court called the arrangement the Two Sages, a phrase that admitted what the written law did not yet say. In the year 655, she had already displaced the sitting Empress Wang and taken the highest female rank, a move secured by the alliance of ministers who resented Wang and by a cold efficiency in palace politics that her enemies would never forgive. In the year 660, both Empress Wang and the favored consort Xiao were executed on charges that ranged from witchcraft to treason. Their deaths, while recorded in the moralizing language of the dynastic histories, also signaled that Wu Zhao had learned the fundamental lesson of the Tang Palace. In the inner court, mercy could be suicide, and ambiguity could be fatal. Her power was not built on terror alone. It rested also on the architecture of a meritocratic state that she helped expand. The Tang examination system, which tested candidates on the classics and letters, already existed, but under Wu, its scope widened in practice. She sponsored special exams, promoted men of ability from families without the hereditary ranks of the old clans, and insisted that the grades of talent recognized by the Board of Rights and the Ministry of Personnel be something more than tribal privilege. Records from the later 7th century note an influx of officials whose grandfathers had not sat with dukes. These new men owed their careers to the woman in the palace, and thus owed their loyalty as well. It is not piety to say that the state benefited. Counties were administered more systematically, tax quotas were met with fewer arrears, and the paper trail thickened into the routines that make a bureaucracy resilient. She also understood the ministry of belief. Buddhism and Taoism had long competed for imperial favor. Wu Zhao made Buddhist prophecy speak in her voice. The Great Cloud Sutra, which promised the appearance of a reincarnate sacred mother to protect the realm, was copied and distributed under imperial orders. At Luoyang, which she favored as an eastern capital, builders erected the Mingtang, a monumental ritual hall in which the emperor or the empress in ritual guise could stage the cosmic cycle of the seasons and the offerings to heaven and earth. At the Longmen Grottos south of Luoyang, artisans carved a monumental Vairocana Buddha, whose serene face later tradition likened to the empress, a likeness that may be more legend than fact, but that captures the way in which sculpture, scripture, and sovereignty braided into one claim. If the mandate of heaven is a story the people tell about prosperity and order, Wu Zhao learned to be the author of that story. Beyond the palace, the empire still needed to be governed with armies and diplomacy. On the western frontier, the Tibetan kingdom, called Tufan in Tang records, pressed into the Tarim oases and threatened the 4 garrisons. The Tang had lost those posts in the year 670. Under Wu's guidance, the generals mounted a recovery and retook the positions in the year 692, restoring a buffer that protected the routes to Central Asia. On the northeastern arc of the empire, Campaigns against Khitan and other steppe powers required supplies, coordination, and the careful appointment of commanders who would not turn victory into private warlordship. The Empress showed a keen sense for matching officers to theaters. She could be ruthless with failures, but she also kept victors close to the capital to prevent any from becoming kingmakers. By the time Emperor Gaozong died in the year 683, Wu Zhao was the most formidable political figure in China. She became Empress Dowager, a title that in Chinese politics can mean caretaker or kingmaker or sovereign in all but name. Within weeks, she deposed her elder son, the new Emperor Zhongzong, when he showed signs of slipping from her guidance, and elevated her younger son, Ruizong, who was more tractable. Real power remained with the Dowager. The device was familiar in Chinese history. The novelty lay in her next step. For several years, she ruled behind a screen, presiding over audience, issuing orders, and naming ministers. Then, in the year 690, she did what no woman had done. She declared the end of Tang and the birth of a new dynasty called Zhou, took the sovereign title for herself, and ruled openly as emperor. To make that leap credible, she did the hard administrative work that gives life to a proclamation. Era names were changed. Seals were recut. The great registers of the realm were revised to show the new house. The old aristocratic families who had dominated the first half-century of Tang found themselves under scrutiny. Those who posed as rivals faced trials that often ended in forced suicide or exile. Those who served ably won promotion. Wu employed investigators and censors who behaved at times like a secret police. Names that frighten later readers. Men like Lai Junchen and Zhou Xing appeared in the record as interrogators with a talent for extracting confessions and an appetite for accusations. Yet the court that these men policed was not a chaos of cruelty. The law continued to be applied, the granaries filled, the autumn tax shipments arrived in the capital, and the rites were performed. In other words, the state functioned. Foreigners continued to come. Inscriptions and chronicles record envoys from Japan, from the Korean kingdom of Silla, from oasis cities in Central Asia, and from the maritime south. They brought tribute and requests pinned to their sleeves. Merchants filled the markets with bolts of silk, poplar wood caravans, narcissus bulbs, and glass. Luoyang glowed with the prosperity of these years. If the dynasty name had changed, the imperial reality had not. Wu's China remained the center of gravity for a broad zone of exchange. She took evident pride in that fact and expected her officials to meet the standard. For all the grandeur, Wu Zetian never forgot the brutal arithmetic of survival in a court. Her daughters and sons were tools and obstacles by turns. Her ministers were patrons, clients, and potential traitors. The chronicles preserve accusations that she ordered the death of an infant daughter years earlier to discredit a rival, and while that account reads like a set piece in moralistic history, it suits the climate of palace politics in which charges of sorcery and murder were weapons used by all sides. What is certain is that she had already chosen the path in which human ties would be sacrificed to imperial calculus. The result was nearly half a century in which her will shaped the center of the Chinese world, first as consort, then as co-ruler, then as regent, and finally as emperor. When she was already in her 8th decade, in the year 705, a palace coup compelled her abdication. The Tang house was restored, and her son returned as emperor. Wu retired to her palace apartments and died soon after. On her instruction, the monument outside her tomb at Qianling was left with its face uninscribed. The blank stone has puzzled readers for centuries. It can be taken as humility, as defiance, or as a final assertion that the record would be written by others and judged by time. What time has concluded is that the woman born as Wu Zhao became the only female emperor in China, that she reached that summit through intelligence, calculation, and implacable will, and that she left the state as orderly as she found it. The severity that marked her rise and rule will occupy the next part of this chapter. The foundations she laid belong here. To understand the ferocity attributed to Wu Zetian, one must first see the machinery of her government from the inside. The Tang state, which she renamed Zhou in the year 690, rested on the 3 departments and 6 ministries, a lattice of clerks and censors that could be turned into an instrument of either routine or terror. She knew the rhythm of that machine as well as any minister. Memorials rose from prefectures to the capital at Luoyang and to its twin at Chang'an. Edicts descended in reply. Between the 2 directions stood the censorate, the office with mandate to inspect, to impeach, and to accuse. Under Wu, this watchman office swelled in power. She gave it men who were her men, investigators of notable talent and alarming appetite. Above all, Lai Junchen and Zhou Xing. The names recur in the court histories of the later 7th century and early 8th century as bywords for interrogation and confession. The method was bureaucratic and theatrical in equal measure. The investigators compiled dossiers that braided rumor with letters, past loyalties with present slights. The charge most often was treason. The fuel was the enmity between her newly risen supporters and the old aristocratic clans of the Northwest, whose ancestors had ridden with the founders of the dynasty. The trials were staged in offices where lacquered tables held tallies of rank and lists of punishments. The accused were invited to name accomplices, and at each turn the circle widened. The law permitted forced suicide as a concession to rank, a silk cord sent as both mercy and sentence. In the years after the proclamation of the Zhou dynasty, there were seasons when that cord traveled often from the inner palace to princely mansions along the avenues of Luoyang. Exile to the far prefectures followed for those spared death. Confiscations of estates bit hard into clan wealth and redistributed land to the treasury and to the new men whose careers the empress promoted. Fear carried into the writing rooms of government. Lai Junchen compiled a manual of devices and stratagems for extracting admissions that later writers quote, "with disgust," a text that reads like a catalogue of the worst instincts of any police apparatus. Anonymous accusations had a place as well. Out in the capital wards and within the court precincts, boxes were set where citizens could submit secret reports. The idea was old in Chinese politics. Under Wu, it acquired a new bite because she used those papers as kindling for purges of court factions. The effect was corrosive. Colleagues stopped trusting colleagues. Households feared their own servants. The gaze of the throne reached into circles that had once felt safe behind family walls. If fear was one pillar of her rule, deliberate policy was the other. Wu enlarged the pool of talent available to her by experimenting with special examinations that identified able men outside the great clans. The classic examinations remained, but they were supplemented by tests that valued literary skill and practical judgment, and by recruitment that drew from provinces that earlier emperors had scorned as peripheral. She appointed commissioners to audit prefectures, strengthened granary management so that reserves from the Yellow River Basin could relieve shortfall in bad years, and moved decisively against local strongmen who hoarded tax grain. In the year 692, the army pushed back into the Tarim Basin and restored Chinese garrisons along the old arc of the Silk Road, recovering ground lost to the Tibetan kingdom 2 decades earlier. The funding for those campaigns depended on meticulous registers and a steady court. That steadiness came from her habit of working within the administrative forms even when she bent them to her will. She used belief as policy with the same care. The Great Cloud Sutra, copied and displayed across the realm, offered a script in which a sacred mother protected the state. Priests and nuns, read it aloud to audiences in city wards and market towns. In Luoyang, the Mingtang, an immense ritual complex, staged the cycle of the seasons. In the Longmen Cliffs south of the city, sculptors carved an image of the cosmic Buddha whose massive serenity, later readers suggested, resembled the Empress, whether by design or by the inevitable tendency of art to flatter its patron. She commissioned new characters for written Chinese, a flourish that asserted the birth of a new era on the very surface of the page. She issued edicts that combined old legal phrases with sudden novelties of style, a signature recognizable to anyone who had served long in the archives. The human cost of her politics was most visible in the palace itself. She had deposed her elder son, Zhongzong, weeks after Gaozong's death because he showed signs of independent mind. She set her younger son, Ruizong, on the throne and ruled in his name. In the year 690, she set aside even that veil and took the sovereign title herself. Princes and cousins became counters in the arithmetic of survival. When murmurs of restoration rose from the old Tang clans, she answered with arrests and punishments. In one dark season, the annalists count strings of exiled courtiers and a cascade of deaths in aristocratic houses. The narrative of the dynastic histories, compiled in the late 9th century and the 11th century by men who disapproved of her sex, as well as her severity, paints her as a figure of unrelieved cruelty. That literature is part of her legacy. So are the tax registers that thicken in her years, and the uneventful ledgers that record rice moving on schedule from hinterland to capital. She was said to have killed an infant daughter to frame a rival in the women's palace at the beginning of her rise, a story repeated in the Old Book of Tang, compiled in the year 945, and in the New Book of Tang, completed in the year 1060. The tale has the shape of parable. It fits the moral needs of historians who wish to show that a woman who reached for the throne did so by violating the most intimate bond. The sources are late and hostile. The historian must keep the charge on the page and decline to make it into certainty. There is no doubt that she engineered the downfall and death of Empress Wang and consort Xiao in the year 660. There is no doubt that she permitted her enforcers to cow the court with interrogations whose cruelty made their own authors legendary. There is also no doubt that she advanced capable ministers and that she promoted a secretary of exceptional gifts, Shangguan Wana, the granddaughter of a minister she had destroyed years earlier, a young woman who became both poet and principal drafter of imperial edicts. The combination of remembered horrors and documented competence is the heart of the case. Foreign observers added their voices. Envoys from Silla, from Japan, and from the Oasis states left notices of a court that gleamed with wealth and that treated them with ceremonial exactness. Buddhist travelers wrote of a capital where scripture copying was an industry and where lay donations flowed into monasteries favored by the sovereign. Along the Tibetan frontier, the chroniclers of her enemies recorded fights that went for and against her generals and treated the woman in Luoyang as a fact rather than an outrage. In Central Asia, Arab geographers who never saw China directly relayed news of a powerful Eastern monarch and her son, who fought to reclaim the old Chinese fortresses in the desert. The world beyond the Wei River watched a monarch who looked like a monarch. Coinage and era names help the modern reader follow the trace of her ambitions. She minted new coins with inscriptions that announced the Zhou house. She declared auspicious era titles that promised harmony and unending years. These were not mere slogans. Era titles governed the dating of documents. They appeared on seals and on the lead strips that fastened bundles of petitions. To alter them was to alter the calendar for every office in every county. She knew that to rule China, one must rule not only cities and armies, but also the script by which clerks count days and validate accounts. When opposition coalesced, it did so within the palace. In her 80th year, in the early months of 705, a faction of senior ministers and palace guards moved to force her abdication. They did not march under banners of reform. They moved quietly, at night, through the corridors of the inner city and into the private rooms where the aged sovereign sat. They required her to name her elder son Zhongzong as successor and to restore the Tang house. She signed, and a messenger carried the written words out to the waiting officials who would turn signature into proclamation. The new court hurried to erase the inscriptions of the Zhou dynasty and to purge the most feared of her investigators. Lai Junchen had already fallen to his own methods years before. Others slipped out of sight. The woman who had made herself emperor returned to her apartments in the palace and died later that year. Her tomb at Qianling lies on Mount Liang, northwest of the Wei River, within sight of the old routes into the city that had been her stage. She shares the mausoleum with Gaozong, the husband whose illnesses opened the door to her co-rule, and with subsidiary tombs for princes and princesses. The stone stele in front of her burial mound is wordless. Later generations called it the stele of no inscription. It can be read as humility, a claim that the works of a life speak for themselves. It can be read as defiance, an invitation to the historians who hated her to write whatever they pleased on paper while leaving the stone untouched. It can be read as the ultimate mark of a sovereign who understood that history is an argument. That argument began quickly. The old Book of Tang and the new Book of Tang gave the moral verdicts of their ages. Sima Guang's Comprehensive Mirror for Aid in Government, compiled in the year 1084, treated her as a caution to princes. Song scholars recounted the savagery of Lai Junchen as if it were a reflection of the soul of the woman who employed him. Ming literati added anecdotes of sexual intrigue to heighten the scandal and to please readers who relished tales of palace excess. In the 20th century and the 21st century, Chinese historians and novelists have been more divided and more curious. Some see a ruler who opened the bureaucracy to talent and who governed with steadiness through decades when other dynasties would have cracked. Others hold that such steadiness was bought at a cost in blood that should be called tyranny. The numbers used to score her reign are hard to fix because the sources do not tally victims with the same exactness that they tally tax grain. What can be counted are the years. Nearly 5 decades at the center of power if one begins with her return from the convent to the palace. 15 years as the recognized sovereign after the proclamation of the Zhou dynasty. 5 years of open rule in her own name before the ministers forced the return of Tang. 4 great victories and reversals on the Tibetan frontier. A handful of show trials that tore the old Northwest clans and sent their lines into exile. Dozens of new officials from families whose grandfathers had never stood in the audience hall. These numbers draw the outline of a life in government in which ambition and method were inseparable. Her legacy is therefore double. She stands as the only woman to claim the title of emperor in China, which matters for what it says about the possibilities within that ancient political culture. She stands as a ruler who used fear with an intelligence that kept the state working even as she punished enemies. She left behind a more open bureaucracy, a repertoire of propaganda that fused Buddhist icon and imperial right, and a caution to any house that believed legitimacy alone could protect it from a rival with talent. The blank stone at Qianling still watches the road, and the reader still chooses what to inscribe upon it. Irene of Athens came to Constantinople from the hills of Attica, a young woman of the Sarantepechos family, which had land, local standing, and the kind of education that taught a daughter to read letters and to speak with composure before men of power. In the year 769, Irene was brought north across the Aegean to the Great Palace as the chosen bride for the young co-emperor Leo, the son of Constantine V. The ceremony joined an Athenian house to an Isaurian dynasty and tethered Greece to the capital in a way that was meant to reassure armies and bishops after a half-century of religious conflict. By the year 771, she had given birth to a son, Constantine, in the porphyry chamber whose purple stone signaled a child born to reigning parents. She received the title Augusta and learned a world where protocol could be as decisive as a sword. The city in which she settled was a marvel. Constantinople sat between the Golden Horn and the Propontis, protected by Theodosian walls and by a tax system that fed warehouses from Bithynia to Thrace. The great palace sprawled from the Hippodrome to the Bucolian harbour, a maze of reception halls, chapels, gardens, and guarded corridors. There, the imperial household ran on the nerves of eunuch officers who controlled entry to the throne and carried orders between inner and outer courts. Titles like Sacellarios and Logothete of the Genicon named treasurers who kept the state's accounts in order. The court's Latin words had long since been translated into Greek speech. The emperor was Basileus. His partner might be Basilicissa. The Senate still met, but the real politics flowed through the palace offices, the patriarchate, and the barracks. Leo IV died in the year 780. Not long after he had elevated his son as junior emperor. The boy was 10. That single fact made Irene regent of the Roman Empire of the East. She was still in her 20s, a widow in a city that had learned to suspect women at the center of power. She began by gathering able men close. The most important for a time was the eunuch Staurakios, whose reach ran from the treasury to the barracks. She moved quickly against the obvious threats. The late emperor's stepbrothers bore the title Caesar. They had friends among officers. In the winter, after Leo died, they were seized, some were blinded, and all were removed to monasteries. Irene spoke the language of family reconciliation in public, while she cut the bloodlines of rivals in private. It was a lesson she would repeat. The religious question defined her early years as regent. Since the days of Leo III and Constantine V, the court had enforced iconoclasm, the policy of removing holy images from churches and outlawing their veneration. This policy carried the force of law, and it had loyal defenders in the army and among bishops placed by the iconoclast emperors. Irene's own piety inclined toward the restoration of images. She also understood that support among the urban clergy and the monastic communities would anchor her regency. She made her move by working through the patriarchal throne. In the year 784, she removed the iconoclast patriarch Paul, who resigned and entered a monastery, and she raised to the see a lay official of polished mind named Tarasios. After he accepted ordination through all the ranks in swift order, Tarasios had the confidence of the palace and enough learning to speak to both court and church. The plan culminated in an ecumenical council. Irene first summoned bishops to Constantinople in the year 786. Armed iconoclast soldiers from the imperial guard shattered that session by surrounding the church and dispersing the fathers. She adapted. The next year, she convened the council again at Nicaea, a choice freighted with memory, since the first great council of the church had met there many centuries earlier. In the autumn of the year 787, the bishops endorsed the veneration of images as a practice that honored the incarnate Christ and the saints without worshipping wood and paint. The decrees were carried back to the capital and proclaimed in solemn processions. Altars were redressed. Mosaics returned to apse and dome. Monasteries that had suffered under iconoclast policy became vocal allies of the empress regent. In a single stroke, Irene stabilized the religious life of her cities and fixed her name to a settlement that endured. Her diplomacy ran on parallel tracks. She opened channels to the Frankish court in the west. In the year 781, she arranged the betrothal of her son to Rotrude, a daughter of Charlemagne, and sent teachers to instruct the girl in Greek. It was a bold scheme to bind the two great Christian courts in marriage. By the later 780s, she broke the pledge and dissolved the match. a decision shaped by suspicions of Frankish ambition, by differences over doctrine and law, and by her own preference for a bride drawn from loyal iconophile families in Asia Minor. Constantine married Maria of Amnia instead. The broken engagement left an aftertaste in Aachen and would return to the story when the map of legitimacy shifted 2 decades later. The Abbasid Caliphate looked east from Baghdad and tested Byzantine frontiers year after year. In the year 782, a great army under Harun, the son of the Caliph al-Mahdi, pushed through the Anatolian themes and approached the Bosporus at Chrysopolis, the shore opposite the capital. The imperial armies could not stop him in the field. Irene and Staurakios negotiated a truce. It required a heavy annual tribute in gold and prisoners, and it bought time for a regency that needed calm to reorganize the army and to nurse the treasury. The decision was unpopular in the barracks. It was the choice of a steward who understood that grand gestures can break when the stores are low. She paid, and Harun withdrew. The lesson was not lost on officers who would soon be asked to accept a grown emperor after years of a mother's rule. Inside the palace, Irene built a government that relied on eunuchs and on educated laymen loyal to her person. She presided at audiences. She read reports. She placed her signature at the foot of decrees with the confidence of an owner rather than a guardian. The ceremonies in the great church and the Hodogan and the Hippodrome affirmed the same message. She was the living center of the state, while the boy emperor learned to ride, to read dispatches, and to look like a ruler. The very success of that arrangement made its end inevitable. In the year 790, the Anatolian themes raised their banners and proclaimed that Constantine VI should rule in fact, and not only in name. Officers marched toward the capital. The court fractured. Irene's advisors were imprisoned or beaten in the streets. The empress herself was forced into retirement in the palace, while the young Basilius assumed sole authority. His single rule did not heal the fissures. Constantine was brave on campaign and impatient in council. He roused new enemies when he divorced the Empress Maria in the year 795 and married Theodote, a relative of a lady of the court. Monastic leaders such as Theodore of Studios denounced the union as unlawful. The Patriarch Tarasios disapproved but did not excommunicate. The affair of the second marriage became a running wound. Meanwhile, defeats in the Balkans against the Bulgars and the sense that the palace was again captive to intrigue weakened his standing with soldiers and officials. Within 2 years, he recalled his mother to the councils of state. In the year 792, Irene returned as co-ruler, her name placed again on documents, her presence again felt in appointments and audiences. She used the opening with her old skill. The men who had grown powerful during her eclipse were set against one another. The 2 most notable eunuchs in the palace, Staurakios restored to favor, and the upstart Aetios, competed for her trust and for control of the army lists. She rediscovered her allies among iconophile monks and urban clergy, who remained grateful for Nicaea. She flattered officers, replaced provincial governors, and husbanded a sense of grievance against the emperor's impetuous temper. The coinage of the later 790s sometimes showed mother and son together, a numismatic advertisement for harmony that no one in the palace believed. It was a courtly fiction that bought time while Irene waited for the moment when force and ceremony would meet. That moment approached as the century turned. The co-rule had grown poisonous. Constantine planned to remove Aetios and to edge his mother away from the treasury and the guard. Irene answered by redoubling her hold on the scolae and the excubators, the palace and field regiments that mattered most inside the walls. She spoke often of order and of the true faith. She rewarded the officers who stood near her dais. She saw to it that the doors of her apartments were watched by men who owed their careers to her hand. The remaining chapters of her story belong to blood, and to the rearrangement of legitimacy in both East and West. Before the deed, there is one more thread to lay down. Throughout these years, she continued to cultivate a public image as the pious guardian of orthodoxy and the mother of the empire. She endowed churches, embroidered liturgy with the presence of the Basilicissa, and made the case that her person and the safety of the Christian commonwealth were one and the same. The stage was set. A mother had been a minister, then a prisoner in her own palace, then a partner in rule. The city that had celebrated the restoration of images now waited to see whether affection for a benefactor could survive disgust at a betrayal. In a world that still preferred a man on the throne, Irene had made herself necessary through piety, craft, and patience. The next part of her life would test what a woman could do to a son and still claim the name of sovereign. The corridors of the Great Palace have a way of remembering footsteps. In the late summer of 797, the sound that mattered most was the quick shuffle of eunuch guards along mosaic floors toward the apartments where Constantine VI slept. For years, the city had watched a mother and son share the throne uneasily. Irene of Athens had been restored as co-ruler in the year 792. She used the interval to rebuild her web of allies among palace officers, bishops, and the scribes who turned spoken orders into law. The young emperor in turn made enemies in the barracks with a rash divorce and in the streets with military defeats. The scene was set for the act that would fix both reputations forever. The legal choreography of a palace coup in Constantinople was rarely improvised. Irene relied on two professionals of the inner court, the veteran Starakios, who knew every treasury key and regimental roster, and the rising eunuch Aetios, who commanded the loyalty of guards. With their help, she reached for the regiments that mattered most inside the walls, the Cholets and the Excubitors, and for the domestics who policed the doors of the imperial bedchamber. She presented the conspiracy as a restoration of order. The empire had suffered reverses in the Balkans, where Bulgar Khans pushed south across the Haemus Mountains and shattered Byzantine formations along the Struma. The emperor's second marriage to Theodote had divided the church and inflamed the eloquent monastery of the Studium, so that priests and monks spoke of scandal in the very streets that led to Hagia Sophia. Relationships frayed in the themes of Asia Minor, where officers tired of being asked to win with thin supplies. Irene told each of these circles that she alone could mend what a boy's impetuousness had torn. The best chroniclers are deadly in their brevity when the knife is already in motion. They say that in the late summer of that year, Constantine was seized and blinded in the purple chamber of the palace. The deed was done with the ritual neatness that allowed courtiers to call it lawful. Blinding had long served as a way to unmake an emperor without inviting the sacrilege of bloodshed. It was a brutal calculus that views eyes as the ransom for a life. The boy who had been carried as a newborn in porphyry lay ruined where he had been born. Theophanes and other writers of the time believed he died soon after of his wounds. Whether he lived for a while or not at all, his reign ended that night. Irene stood unopposed. The next morning, the chancery wrote a new style for the ruler. She did not accept the lesser title usually given to women. She took the masculine honorific and called herself Basileus. She was emperor, not empress, by the plain text of her own decrees. This was an assertion that startled even a city accustomed to surprises. Her image alone appeared on gold solidi struck in the imperial mint at Constantinople, the facing bust crowned and robed, holding cross and scepter. Coins passed from merchants to sailors, and from farmers to tax collectors, and carried that image into every reach of the Mediterranean economy. When litigants cited the law, they wrote the era as the reign of Irene, the emperor. She stood in imperial purple in Hagia Sophia, and received the acclamations that had greeted her forebears. She issued appointments and recalls. She signed orders to soldiers stationed in Dyrrhachium and Thrace and Cappadocia. For 5 years, she ruled in her own right. Her government combined piety and show with practical sense. She continued to honor the decisions of the council at Nicaea that she had helped convene a decade earlier. Churches were restored and mosaics repaired. Monasteries that had suffered under iconoclast policy remained her warmest partisans. The patriarch Tarasios, whose elevation had anchored her regency, now worked in tandem with a woman who was no longer a guardian but the sovereign herself. Public festivals and processions multiplied around the great church, and her name threaded the litanies in a way that fused devotion with loyalty to the throne. In law courts, the eparch of the city enforced measures against price gouging during shortages and punished officials who stole from the annona, the supply of grain that kept Constantinople fed. The state finances had been strained by tribute payments to the Abbasids during the earlier regency. Now she pursued economy where she could find it. She sent commissioners into the provinces to audit tax rolls and to ensure that the fisc received its due. The silk workshops attached to the palace hummed, the old monopoly that made the court the arbiter of luxury still a dependable source of revenue and diplomacy. Her foreign policy was steady rather than brilliant. Along the eastern frontier, the Abbasid Caliphate was in the ascendant. Harun, who would later be called al-Rashid, continued the pattern of annual raiding across the Anatolian themes when the snows melted in the eastern mountains. Irene paid for peace when she had to, calculating that gold and captives could buy time to repair fortresses and rotate weary garrisons. To the north, the Bulgar Khans pressed into Thrace. When Byzantium was strong, they took subsidies to stay quiet. When Byzantium trembled, they raided. Irene negotiated truces and avoided set-piece battles that could turn disaster into catastrophe. The empire had known emperors who courted glory and found graves. She preferred a balance of accounts that kept the frontier quiet enough for commerce. The West posed a different sort of challenge. In the winter of the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as emperor in Rome. The ceremony on Christmas Day in the old Basilica of St. Peter signaled a claim that the Roman Empire could be reborn in a Frankish key when Constantinople was ruled by a woman. The papal argument ran that the Roman imperial throne was vacant since a woman could not occupy it. This logic suited Frankish pride and Roman necessity. In Constantinople, the news arrived with the fury one would expect. The Ministry of Foreign Letters composed answers that refused to concede any legitimate imperial rival in the West. And yet the channels remained open. There were embassies and discussions about borders along the Adriatic and in Venetia. There were rumors, recorded by later writers and likely passed through the embassies of merchants as much as diplomats, that Charlemagne and Irene might consider a marriage that would fuse the two imperial lines. Whether those proposals were polite fictions or genuine experiments in statecraft, they did not outlast the next upheaval inside the palace. The fault lines that brought Irene to power did not disappear after she crowned herself. They only shifted. Staurakios, who had served her for years and who had orchestrated triumphs and treaties, suffered a stroke and died soon after. Aetios remained, and his influence widened across the army lists. Great officers resented the dominance of eunuchs who could not command on campaign, yet could unmake generals with a word. The treasury officials complained about pensions paid to guards whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned. The iconophile clergy, who had been the backbone of her ascent, began to wonder how a pious settlement sat beside the memory of a blinded son. Irene's reliance on the machinery of the inner palace left the outer bureaucracy nursing grievances that had a way of becoming coup plots. The man who decided to act was Nikephoros, the finance minister, the logothete of the Genicon. He was a civil official of formidable skill, who had balanced the books in years of stress and who judged that the empire needed a different hand at the helm. In the late summer of the year 802, he orchestrated a swift takeover of the capital, while Irene was distracted with preparations for a new round of negotiations with the Franks. The guards in whom she had placed faith stood aside. Nikephoros won the support of the Senate and the Patriarch. He was crowned in Hagia Sophia as Emperor Nikephoros I. The coup unfolded without civil war because he understood that speed was mercy and that mercy was prudent politics. Irene, who had once been the master of such moments, was now the object of one. Her end came quietly and without the comfort of her city. The new emperor sent her into honorable exile across the Aegean to the island of Lesbos. The chroniclers, who never pass up a detail that turn a life into moral lesson, say that she supported herself by carding and spinning wool. That may be an embroidery added by pious authors who like to imagine a proud ruler brought low. What is certain is that she died within a year, in the autumn of 803, in a house far from the marble and porphyry of the palace, where she had once decided the fate of Christendom's greatest city. She had ruled as emperor for 5 years, and had been the principal force in government for nearly 2 decades before that. Her legacy resists simplicity. The Church remembers her as the sovereign who ended iconoclasm and restored the veneration of holy images at a council that mattered for 1,000 years of worship and art. The state remembers her as a politician of colossal will who blinded her own son to keep power, an act that even her admirers struggle to forgive. Western chronicles treat her as the foil that allowed a Frankish king to become emperor in Rome, the absence that justified a presence. Byzantine historians put her in a long line of rulers who used the palace to keep a fragile empire alive. The coins that bear her portrait tell their own truth. For a few years there was a single person on the face of the solidus, and that person was a woman who called herself emperor. When scholars weigh her reign, they argue not only about morality, but about capacity. She managed the court that had consumed emperors. She bargained peace when war would have been ruin. She used liturgy to knit a city back together after a generation of religious quarrel. She also made the choice that destroys families and dynasties alike. The violent act in the Purple Chamber becomes the hinge on which the rest of the story swings. It costs her a place in the instinctive affection that people reserve for rulers who suffer rather than inflict. It gives her a place in the hard annals of survival. The capital itself changed as her story closed. Hagia Sophia had been filled once more with images. Markets on the maze returned to ordinary noise. The bureaucracy resumed the steady business of salt taxes and land surveys. The frontiers demanded rations and boots. In the west, a new emperor sat in Aachen and wrote letters to monasteries and counts as if he was Caesar. In the east, men called Nikephoros took their seats in councils that once had feared Irene. The city adapted because cities do. The memory of the woman who had governed it remained in the skylines of coins and in the quiet fact that for a span of years, the ceremonies had pronounced a woman emperor and the world had not ended. Her contemporaries could not decide whether to call her saint or usurper. Posterity kept the argument alive. The only safe conclusion is that she was one of those rulers who remade the possibilities of her age. No basilica inscription carved in one moment can capture the contradictions that followed. She was the banisher of iconoclasm and the maker of a blind son. She was the Athenian who became master of Constantinople. She was the woman who taught a city that the word emperor could be spoken in the feminine without the dome falling in. The child who would be called Joanna the Mad was born in Toledo in the winter of 1479, the third daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. She opened her eyes in a kingdom still learning to be a nation. Castile's sheep guild, the Mester, sent wool down the Cañadas toward the cloth cities of Flanders. The Alcabala, a sales tax, swelled the royal coffers. Hermandad militias patrolled market roads. In the south, the Nasrid kingdom of Granada held fast behind its red walls. In the west, caravels out of Palos and Cadiz were beginning to push into an ocean that maps still sketched with sea monsters. The dynastic project of Joanna's parents aimed to stitch these strands into a single fabric. Husband and wife governed together, but kept their crowns legally distinct, a fact that would matter greatly when their children grew. Joanna grew in the itinerant courts of Castile and Aragon, where learning and ceremony lived side by side. She had tutors who drilled her in Latin and law, music and piety. She read romances and chronicles, the Libro de Ora and works of devotion that taught a princess the theatre of prayer. She watched her mother dispense justice from a dais and her father bargain with nobles in the language of fief and favour. When she was 13, a treaty in a Portuguese town called Tordesillas drew an invisible meridian from the Arctic to the Antarctic and assigned to Castile lands to the west and to Portugal lands to the east. That instrument would one day make Seville a counting house for silver, born in mountains beyond the ocean. It also enlarged the horizon of a princess who would be asked to marry not merely a prince, but an entire policy. Dynastic calculation chose Joanna's husband. In the summer of 1496, she sailed from the port of Laredo with a fleet that carried musicians, ladies, confessors, and crates of Castilian plate engraved with pomegranates and lions. Her destination was the Low Countries, the great plain of rivers and markets that had belonged to the Dukes of Burgundy. There she met Philip, called the Handsome, son of the Habsburg Archduke Maximilian and of Mary of Burgundy. The marriage took place at Leer beneath the vaults of St. Gomarus in early autumn. The match fused a Castilian and Aragonese princess to a young ruler whose domains included Flanders, Brabant, Holland, and the rich cities of Ghent and Bruges, Mechelen and Antwerp. A proverb hung over the Habsburg house that while others waged war, Austria married. This wedding was an example in gold and silk. The Burgundian court into which Joanna stepped was unlike the sober camps of her parents. Tournaments, pageants, and banquets filled an almost theatrical calendar. Courtiers spoke French and Dutch as well as Latin. Guilds paraded reliquaries and silver maces through market squares. The treasurers counted coin not only from land rents but from excises on cloth and beer, from staple rights on river trade, from the tolls of the Scheldt and the Meuse. Joanna learned new rhythms. She also learned that her husband was as quick to follow pleasure as policy. Affection between the pair was real and immediate, and it fed a jealousy that would be weaponized by enemies later. Even in these first months, ambassadors noted quarrels followed by reconciliations that the diplomats called ardent. Children arrived in a pattern that would decide European history. In the spring of 1498, a daughter, Eleanor, was born at Leuven. In the winter of 1500, a son, Charles, was born in Ghent, a city whose belfry bells and cloth halls would one day salute him as prince and emperor. In the winter of 1500, another daughter, Isabella, was born in Brussels. Each birth confirmed that the lines that ran from the Pyrenees to the North Sea had braided into one family. Meanwhile, death rearranged the chessboard in Spain. In the summer of 1497, Joanna's only brother Juan, heir to both Castile and Aragon, died at Salamanca shortly after a marriage designed to bind Spain to the Habsburgs from the other side, for he had taken as wife Margaret, sister of Joanna's husband. The following year, Joanna's elder sister Isabella, Queen of Portugal by marriage, died in childbirth. The infant Miguel, who united the claims of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal in one fragile body, died in the year 1500. With those three deaths, the line of succession turned toward the young woman far away in Flanders. Spanish jurists, ever precise, identified her as Princesa de Asturias for Castile and Princesa de Girona for Aragon, the standard titles for an heir apparent. A kingdom of wheat and merino wool, of towns chartered under Alfonso the Wise and of seaports that smelled of tar and brine, now looked to a duchess in a far court to become its queen. Ferdinand and Isabella summoned Joanna and Philip to Spain to receive oaths from the Cortes. The journey began late in 1501. The couple crossed a winter bay of Biscay and rode through snow and welcome arches toward Toledo. The Cortes of Castile met at Toledo and then at Valladolid across the year 1502 to swear allegiance to Joanna as the future sovereign. The ceremonies were elaborate, with banners hung from cathedral piers and guilds presenting keys and bread and wine as tokens of obedience. From there they rode east to the Aragonese lands where the Cortes of Zaragoza recognized her as heir under a different legal grammar. Since Aragon's laws guarded fueros and privileges jealously and would allow her father a stronger hand as king, the public rituals mattered. They made the Castilian towns and the Aragonese estates look a princess in the eye and say the words that become a government when written down by clerks. Joanna's time in Spain was marked by both celebration and strain. She was heavily pregnant as she moved between cities, and in the spring of 1503 at Alcalá de Henares, she gave birth to a son, Ferdinand, named for his grandfather. That boy would one day rule Austria and Spain when his elder brother chose the German crown. At the same time, her marriage showed cracks that courtiers could not miss. Philip liked the hunting fields and the dances of Burgundian evenings. He had mistresses. Joanna's deep attachment sharpened into jealousy that spilled beyond private rooms. None of this was unusual in princely marriages, but it fed a narrative that men around her would find useful later, that her emotions made her unfit to rule. The fault lines of policy were even more dangerous than those of temperament. Queen Isabella was aging but still formidable. She expected her daughter to return to the Low Countries obedient to her parents' counsel. Philip expected to return as a prince who would speak for his wife and who would one day claim to be King of Castile by right of marriage. The two visions were not compatible. Isabella's will was drafted with a clear eye. In late autumn of 1504, she died at Medina del Campo. The will named Joanna as Queen of Castile and stipulated that if the queen were absent or unable to govern, Ferdinand would act as regent. It also instructed that Castile's American enterprise, now shaped through the Casa de la Contratación established at Seville in 1503, remain under Castilian control. This legal instrument, read aloud before prelates and notaries, became the core of the next struggle. Philip moved fast. He sailed for Spain in the spring of 1506, flying Burgundian colors. Flemish councillors filled his train. He styled himself Philip, by the grace of God, King of Castile, Leon, Granada, and Seville, a title that presumed his wife's presence but asserted his own authority. He courted Castilian nobles, resentful of Ferdinand and eager to check the power of towns. The Marquis of Villena and other grandees opened their houses to him. The Cortes of Castile, convened at Valladolid, wrangled over oaths and coin. Meanwhile, Ferdinand, who had just concluded a long Italian war that left Aragonese arms controlling Naples, read the field with the cold patience of a man who had survived rebellions and sieges. For a season, the peninsula had 2 kings in practice and 1 queen in name. The climax came in the agreements drawn up at Salamanca and then at Villafafela. The first accord, in the autumn of 1505, attempted to balance claims by acknowledging Joanna as queen, while recognizing that her father and her husband would share governance. No one kept that balance. In early summer of 1506 at Villafafela, in a windy plain of Zamora, Ferdinand and Philip met under tents and put their names to a new concord. Ferdinand renounced the government of Castile and retired to Aragon, an old fox biding time in his ancestral house. Philip stood triumphant as the acting ruler of Castile in the name of his wife. The chancery began to stamp documents with his style. coins were prepared. The Burgundian faction celebrated as if an old kingdom had already become a northern dependency. It did not last. In early autumn, Philip sickened after a game of ball near Burgos and died within weeks, not yet 30. Rumor supplied poison, but fever and exhaustion explain more. The court staggered. The Burgundian councillors who had flattered a young king scattered or clung to offices that evaporated. The Castilian nobility looked from the widow to the absent father in Aragon and measured advantage. The queen, who had loved her husband with an intensity that had worried her mother, collapsed into grief that shocked the public. This is the moment when legend begins to overtake paperwork. Ambassadors wrote home that Joanna would not relinquish Philip's body to burial, that she traveled with his coffin from Burgos toward the Cartuja at Miraflores and then to the royal vaults at Granada. Some testimonies say she opened the casket at night to embrace what was left, and that she forbade women to approach the bier out of a jealousy that would not die. Other witnesses, cooler, reported a devastated widow who moved under guard and ceremonial necessity from town to town while men around her argued law. While grief froze the queen, politics thawed around her. The Council of Castile continued in session because paperwork is a government's heartbeat. Towns demanded that alcabala rates be stabilized. The Casa de la Contratación sent pilots to sound the sandbars of Sanlúcar and drew up new ordinances for fleets bound to Hispaniola. In the countryside, harvests were gathered by men who blessed or cursed the weather and not the king. Yet a kingdom cannot drift long. In the spring of 1500, Ferdinand returned. He did not march as conqueror. He came as father and as the executor named in Isabella's will, and he brought with him the reputation of the Grand Capitan's campaigns in Italy and the loyalty of officers who had eaten Aragonese salt for years. He assumed the government of Castile as regent and began to gather the queen's person into a confinement that he would present as care. The European picture made the stakes higher still. In Mechlin, Joanna's sister-in-law, Margaret of Austria, took up the regency of the Low Countries for the children of Joanna and Philip. The infant Prince Charles grew under her discipline, speaking French to his governesses and Dutch to his attendants, learning Latin from tutors who taught him to see Christendom as a chessboard with pieces named Naples, Flanders, Iberia, and the Empire. Maximilian, the Habsburg grandfather, nudged the board from Innsbruck and Vienna. A child in Ghent, a grieving queen in Castile, a calculating king in Aragon, and a widow regent in the Low Countries formed a constellation that would soon make an empire on which the sun rarely set. In that constellation, Joanna was both the brightest star and the most occluded, the legal keystone upon which others would build. Philip died with a speed that frightened courtiers and fed rumor. It was early autumn in 1506, near Burgos, after a game of ball and a cold draught of water. Within days he was gone, a Habsburg prince who had crossed the mountains to become king of Castile by marriage and ambition. The court closed ranks around the young widow and around the royal coffin that bore the arms of Burgundy and Castile. Joanna entered a grief that startled even seasoned diplomats. Ambassadors wrote home that she could not speak his name without tremor. Her ladies watched through the night while the chapel candles sank to pools of wax. The next months became the kernel of a story that posterity would never stop retelling. From Burgos the coffin moved, first toward the Carthusian monastery of Miraflores, then by stages along winter roads toward the royal centers of the realm. Chroniclers describe a procession that traveled by night, as if the widow sought to keep other women out of the line of sight of her dead husband. They say the queen paused in churchyards and ordered the casket opened so that she might embrace and weep. They say the procession turned aside whenever a convent stood ahead on the road, as if to avoid the eyes of nuns. Other witnesses, closer to the chancery than to the hearth, record a protocol-driven journey made under guard while men argued law around her. The truth sits somewhere between legend and memorandum. What is certain is that grief and politics braided together, and that men who hoped to rule in Joanna's name found in her mourning a reason to call her unfit. By the spring of 1507 she had delivered her last child, a daughter named Catherine, born at Torquemada on the Pisuerga. The infant would one day be Queen of Portugal. The mother, still not 30, was a queen in name, whose father and councillors meant to make her a queen without power. Ferdinand came from Aragon with the calm expression of a veteran who had weathered sieges and betrayals. He offered comfort and took custody. The Council of Castile continued its business in Valladolid and Burgos, drafting decrees and balancing accounts. But the page that mattered most was a warrant for the permanent residence of the Queen at Tordesillas. Tordesillas sat on the Duero, a market town known to law for the Atlantic Treaty signed 2 decades earlier, and known to devotion for the convent of Santa Clara, where royal women had lodged since the 14th century. Across a courtyard from the convent stood a royal palace, not grand by the measure of Seville or Toledo, but ample enough to hold a small court. In 1509, Joanna arrived there with her little daughter, a handful of faithful ladies, and the men whom Ferdinand appointed to guard and to govern her days. The key figure in practice was the Marquis of Denia, head of a household that owed allegiance to Ferdinand. He controlled doors and diet. He decided which petitions reached the Queen and which were folded away. He reported to the regent as jailers do, with careful lists of habits and moods. Life in confinement acquired a routine that outsiders read as a diagnosis. In some seasons, Joanna rose before dawn and heard Mass with quiet focus. In others, she refused clergy and sacraments for weeks at a time. She ordered her rooms aired in winter and sealed in summer, then reversed the command. She played with her daughter and then demanded the child be kept from sight. She feared poison and would not taste meat or soup unless a trusted woman ate first. There were months when she insisted on sleeping fully dressed, and months when she would not change her linen. Attendants dreaded the nights when shrieks echoed from the palace apartments to the convent walls. Then came mornings when she sat at a table and in a steady hand signed receipts for candles, oil, and bread. The documents that survive are cool and exact. They speak of inventories and repairs. They do not settle the question of illness. They record the fact of captivity. The political world did not pause to calibrate her mind. Ferdinand governed Castile as regent and pursued the old Aragonese policy in Italy. Naples was under his house. The Crown of Aragon watched the sea lines that led from Barcelona to Sicily. When the old king died in 1516 at Madrigalejo, the hinge of Europe turned again. The heir to both crowns was Joanna, who lived behind guarded doors on the Duero, and her eldest son, Charles, who had grown to manhood in the Low Countries under the stern eye of his Aunt Margaret of Austria. He crossed the Bay of Biscay in 1517 with a deck full of Flemish councillors and a treasury that needed Castilian coin. In Valladolid, the young prince was proclaimed Charles I of Castile and Aragon, and very soon after he sought the German crown that would make him Emperor Charles V. Before he left for those northern elections, he travelled to Tordesillas to see his mother. The meeting has been described by pens both sympathetic and hostile. The son found a woman who looked older than her years, who spoke with clarity at moments, and who drifted into fury at others. He needed a signature that would allow him to act as her co-ruler, and then, in practice, as sole governor while he was abroad. He had bishops and doctors draw up statements attesting to her incapacity. He had the Cortes of Castile accept him as joint sovereign in 1518. He returned to the north in 1519 to secure the imperial title. In his absence, the kingdom that had accepted a foreign-raised prince began to ask whether its own customs and coin were safe in foreign hands. The revolt that followed is remembered as the uprising of the comunidades, the communities of the towns. It was part tax protest and part defense of local rights, part anger at foreign officers, and part ambition of local leaders. In the summer and autumn of 1520, the cities of Castile raised militias, seized royal strongholds, and formed a revolutionary junta that met in the very town where the queen lived under guard. Tordesillas fell to the comuneros in early autumn without a siege. Their leaders, among them Juan de Padilla of Toledo and the Bishop of Zamora, Antonio de Acuña, believed that the daughter of Isabella, the queen named in law, could be persuaded to endorse their movement. They went before her with their petitions and pronounced titles and asked her to sign. What happened in that audience has been argued ever since. Some accounts claim Joanna received the junta coldly and refused to countenance rebellion. Others suggest she listened, asked shrewd questions about coin and garrisons, and then declined to sign because she recoiled from bloodshed, or because she understood that to endorse one faction would be to become a puppet of another. There is also the simplest reading, that she could not be made to move by anyone's counsel in those days, whether her sons or her subjects. The junta lingered too long. Royalist forces regrouped. In winter, the Constable of Castile and the Admiral of Castile retook Tordesillas and removed the queen to tighter quarters. The revolt burned on into the next year, until royal cavalry shattered the Comunero army at Villar in April of 1521. The leaders were taken and executed. The towns submitted and sought pardons. From that point, the queen's captivity grew more severe. Charles returned to Spain in triumph in 1522. He came as emperor as well as king, crowned in Germany and confirmed by victories in Castile. He visited his mother again at Tordesillas with a train that included men who would govern the peninsula for decades. He kept her under the care of the Marquis of Denier and then of the Marquis's son. He removed the little Catherine from her mother's apartments as the girl approached marriageable age. In 1525, Catherine of Austria married John III of Portugal, a match that pleased both dynasties and that left Joanna bereft of her last daily companion. A decade later, Mary, another daughter, who had been widowed young by the death of Louis of Hungary at Mohacs, served as governor in the Low Countries. Eleanor, the eldest, became first Queen of Portugal and later of France. Isabella became Queen of Denmark. Ferdinand, the younger son born at Alcalá, prepared for the Austrian inheritance. Charles held Spain and a globe of connections that stretched from Antwerp to Mexico City and from Naples to Cusco. At the center of the web, the queen whose body gave the Union legal shape remained behind a guarded door. Conditions in Tordesillas veered with the temper of governors and the ebb and flow of resources. There were winters when the palace rooms were so cold that braziers barely took the edge off the damp. There were summers when the smell from the river rose into the galleries. There were seasons when the queen refused to see priests, and others when she asked repeatedly for confession. There were long spells of silence broken by fits of rage in which she cursed the servants and then wept and begged their pardon. A German traveler claimed to have heard her singing old romances in the night. A cleric reported that she would not permit Holy Week processions to pass beneath her windows. An officer warned the court that too many curious visitors had bribed guards to peer at the queen through cracks in a door, as if she were a relic or a beast. From time to time, the council sent physicians who prescribed regimen and recorded testimony. The king received their reports and filed them among papers that authorized the continuation of the only policy he trusted, that the queen remain where she was. The final decade had its own rhythm. In the later 1540s and early 1550s, Charles wrestled with German wars and with the Reformation that fractured the old religious unity. He moved the court through Valladolid, Toledo, and Madrid, a town that would soon grow from a hunting lodge into a capital. He sent money to Tordesillas when funds ran low and ordered the governor to keep his mother safe from rumor. In 1553, he married his son Philip to Mary Tudor of England. For a moment, Joanna's grandson sat beside a queen in London whose childhood had crossed Joanna's story in blood and lore. In the spring of 1555, Joanna's long confinement ended. She died at Tordesillas at 75, in a palace that had become a convent of grief. Afterward, the men who had managed her captivity arranged the rituals of a queen. Her body traveled south along the Duero and through Castile to Granada, where the royal chapel gathered the bones of the New Spain. There she lies near Philip the Handsome, near Isabella and Ferdinand, beneath effigies carved in white stone. The chapel's gilded grille holds back the murmur of tourists and the prayers of the devout. The chronicles give her two names. One is Queen of Castile and of Aragon by right. The other is Joanna the Mad. The first is a sentence in a law book. The second is a verdict, delivered by centuries of repeating the same set of scenes. What are we to make of the charge? The evidence is mixed. There is no doubt that she suffered torments of mind that today would be called clinical by physicians and that were called melancholy and frenzy in her century. There is no doubt that those torments were seized upon by a husband who wanted to rule, by a father who would not yield, and by a son who needed the keystone of his claim to lie still. The conditions of her confinement often looked like a design to degrade and to frighten. The queen, who as a girl had been drilled in Latin, could still sign a receipt for candles and write a firm yes or no on a petition. She could also sit for weeks in silence while men asked her to bless their revolts or their regencies. The historian's task is to hold both truths. She was ill. She was used. The political consequences of that use are immense. Because Joanna remained queen-in-law, every measure of Ferdinand and of Charles had to be couched as acting on her behalf, or acting with her assent, even when she could not speak it. That legal fiction gave continuity to a kingdom passing through one of the most astonishing enlargements in European history. It also placed a woman at the center of one of the largest imperial constructions ever attempted, and then insisted that she be not seen and not heard. The line that runs from the Cortes at Toledo and Zaragoza in 1502 through the council chamber at Tordesillas and the imperial diets in Germany leads straight to a world in which Spanish is spoken on both sides of an ocean. In the ledgers of that world, the signature that made all others tidy belongs to a queen who wrote it behind a door that others kept locked. Mary Tudor was born at Greenwich Palace in the cold months of 1516, a child of ceremony and calculation, christened Mary in the friary church at observant Greenwich while the Thames ran hard and grey below the palace gardens. Her father was Henry VIII, a king whose imagination for sovereignty would reorder church and law. Her mother was Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, a Spanish princess who brought to England the weight of Iberian diplomacy and a conscience formed in the old faith. From childhood, Mary learned Latin and music, spoke French and a measured Spanish, read the Book of Hours and the Chronicles of English kings, and played the virginals so well that ambassadors wrote home about the clear authority of her hands. It was the education of a princely child who might one day marry a continent rather than a man. The world that raised her altered with a swiftness that left scars. In the summer of 1533, Henry's break with Rome turned the girl who had been called princess into Lady Mary by act of council and statute. The king's marriage to Anne Boleyn and the statute of supremacy made him head of the church in his realm. The new order demanded assent. Mary, ordered to deny the validity of her mother's marriage and to accept her own bastardy, resisted with a stubbornness that frightened those who loved her. There were months of cold rooms and sharp words and the ache of separation from Catherine, who died at Kimbleton in the winter of 1536. At last, Mary yielded, signed the submission that admitted her father's supremacy and her own diminished status, and by that signature recovered a precarious place in a family that would bury two queens before it found a son who lived. When Henry died in the winter of 1547, the crown passed to Edward, a boy of 9 whose mind was quick and whose guardians were earnest Protestants. The realm drifted by design toward the liturgy of Zurich and Strasbourg. A new Book of Common Prayer replaced the Latin rites. Stone images were pulled from niches. Altars gave way to tables. Bishops who favored reform rose. Above all, Thomas Cranmer at Canterbury and Nicholas Ridley in London. Mary, who kept the Mass on her estates by the indulgence of her royal kin and the uneasy forbearance of council, became a living contradiction to the state's theology. In the early years of 1551 and 1552, the council demanded she conform. She refused. The Emperor Charles, her kinsman through Catherine of Aragon, threatened English merchants in the Low Countries if Mary were coerced. The council compromised. The princess heard Mass in private and waited out a reign that seemed likely to be long until it suddenly was not. Illness carried Edward toward an early death in the summer of 1553. In his last months, a plan was drafted in his own young hand and polished by the Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, the most formidable politician of the day. The device for the succession named Lady Jane Grey, a granddaughter of Henry's younger sister, as heir in place of Mary and of Elizabeth. The instrument defied the statute that had restored both daughters to the line of succession in the reign of their father. It rested on the fear that Mary would return England to Rome, and on the ambition of a faction that bet on a malleable queen married to a Dudley son. When Edward died in early July, Jane was proclaimed queen in London and taken to the Tower, that fortress which turned so often into a palace of brief reigns. Mary had not waited to be told. With the news of the king's decline, she rode hard to East Anglia, to the red brick of Kenninghall, and then to Framlingham Castle, on its earthen mount above the Suffolk Mere. There she issued letters under her signet to sheriffs and nobles, reminding them of the statute and of her blood, calling them by name to do the thing that still mattered most in a political nation, to choose publicly. Men came. The Howards remembered old loyalties. Country gentlemen mustered tenants. The ports sent shot and powder. In London, the council watched allies waver. Northumberland marched east to cut off the princess and found his levies thinning in the summer heat, men who had been ready to enforce the device now reading the wind. On a July day, the council shifted. The bells of the City of London rang for Mary. Northumberland surrendered at Cambridge. Jane's reign, later counted as 9 days, ended with the same doomed quiet with which it had begun. Mary entered London on the 3rd of August of that year, riding through Cheapside with her sister Elizabeth beside her, and the streets pressed with people who cried that old word which binds sovereign and city, Viva. She was crowned in Westminster on the 1st day of October by Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, with the old rite of anointing that claimed for queens the holy oil of kings. The coronation set the tone of a reign that would speak in the grammar of continuity, even as it undertook to unwind 2 decades of revolution. She restored the Great Seal that bore the arms of England without the new devices favored by the reformers, commanded the mints to strike coins with her single effigy that announced the presence of a woman who would rule in her own right, and called a parliament to meet in the last days of October. That first parliament addressed religion by statute in the way that English governments now did everything that mattered. It repealed the most recent innovations of Edward's time, including the acts that enforced the new prayer book and the marriage of clergy, and it acknowledged that the realm had been torn by division. Bishops who had been deprived under Edward were restored to their sees, among them Edmund Bonner in London, Reformers who had held high place were summoned to answer for their preaching and their administration. At Paul's Cross and in the guild halls, men argued about images and vestments, while the clergy began to say the Latin Mass in parish churches again. The Queen moved slowly on the question that cut to the root of sovereignty, the royal supremacy. She knew that to undo that title too quickly would alienate laymen who had bought monastic lands and would surrender a lever over the church that even a Catholic monarch could use. The first steps, therefore, were careful. Statutes came down. Rights returned. The supremacy bided its time. Meanwhile, the hardest question of state stood before the council table. A queen who wished to secure her policy and her dynasty needed a husband and an heir. Suitors gathered, as suitors do, when a dowry looks like a kingdom. There were English candidates whom the city preferred. Men like Edward Courtenay, Earl of Devon, handsome and malleable, and politically useful to those who wished to keep the crown anchored to home. There was a foreign prince whose name carried weight from Antwerp to Naples, Philip, son of the Emperor Charles. The imperial ambassador, Simon Renard, worked with patience and flattery to convince the Queen that a Habsburg marriage would knit England to the great Catholic house and shield her reforms with continental power. The city of London and many of the gentry felt a chill at the thought. They feared Spanish garrisons and a river of offices granted to strangers. They remembered the recent war with France and counted how a Spanish alliance would draw them into new quarrels. The Queen weighed the counsels of country and conscience and chose the marriage that aligned policy with piety. The treaty had to fit English pride. In January of 1554, the articles were concluded. Philip would be styled king, but he would hold that style only during the marriage. He would bring no Spaniards to English office. He would not remove treasure or ships from the realm. If there were a child, that child would inherit England and the Low Countries if Philip's only son by his Portuguese wife died without issue. If Mary died without a child, the crown would pass as English law determined. The clauses read like a hedge against fear, and they were that a net of promises meant to still the anger of a people who did not wish to be vassals of Spain. The paper did not still the anger. In the weeks that followed, Kent rose in arms under Sir Thomas Wyatt, a gentleman of Allington who had fought in France and who wrote poems well enough to be remembered by scholars long after his sword was burnt on the block. Plans for Allied risings in the West Country and in the Midlands failed in the first hard frost. Wyatt gathered men along the Medway and marched for London in late January and early February. The Queen, who had known fear before and had learned to ride through it, went to the Guildhall on the first day of February and spoke to the aldermen and the citizens with a steadiness that echoed through chronicles. She told them she was the true mother of the Commonwealth, that she stood ready to live and die among them for the law and the faith, that they should take heart and hold the city for their Queen. London did. The gates were shut, cannon were planted at the bridge. When Wyatt's column made its way along the riverbank and tried the gates at Southwark and then at Ludgate, it found them barred. His men broke. He was taken near Temple Bar and led to the Tower. In the days that followed, the Crown used the scaffold to write a warning into the winter air. Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, father of Jane, died on Tower Hill. Jane and her young husband were executed in the Tower, the grey walls making a frame for the tragedy of a girl queen whose 9 days had become a political symbol too dangerous to live. The rebellion left behind a problem the Queen could not ignore. Her half-sister Elizabeth had been the hope of many who feared a Spanish match and a Catholic turn. The council took Elizabeth to the Tower in the spring and then to guarded rooms at Woodstock. No proof could be made that would justify a trial. Suspicion lingered. The younger sister learned caution from the elder's resolve and from the sight of winter snow on scaffold planks. The episode hardened minds on both sides. For Mary, it confirmed that her enemies would cloak themselves in the language of liberty when they meant to cloak themselves in the cloth of power. For Elizabeth, it taught that survival required patience and that the city could love a princess and still follow a queen. In July of 1554, the marriage was made at Winchester Cathedral. The nave was hung in rich cloth. The Bishop of Winchester, Gardiner, wrote the vows and pronounced them. Philip looked older than his years, dark-suited and formal, a prince who had governed the Low Countries and studied the papers of Antwerp financiers. He spoke little English and relied on Spanish and Latin at court. The couple rode to Hampton Court and then to Windsor, under arches where the city displayed pageants in which virtue spoke in verse, a medieval form that still had force in a people that loved theatre. The court settled to wait for the one thing that mattered most to a dynasty, the stir of a child. At the same time, the Queen moved to complete the settlement of religion. She needed Rome's absolution. She needed a way to reconcile the realm to the papacy, without unhousing the gentlemen and merchants who had purchased monastic land in the late 1520s and 1530s. Cardinal Reginald Pole, an English exile of royal blood who had resisted Henry's revolutions and who had been made a legate of the Pope, crossed the Channel in the autumn of 1554. Parliament had been called to Westminster. In the last days of November and the first days of December, the legate entered the chapel and extended the papal pardon to Lords and Commons for the schism of 2 decades. The Houses petitioned the Crown to allow the return of obedience to the See of Rome. The Crown accepted. The King and Queen kneeled for the absolution, and the nuncio pronounced the reconciliation. A statute followed that is remembered as the second act of repeal. It rolled back the religious legislation of Henry, as well as of Edward. It confirmed, with care, the possession of former monastic lands in lay hands in order to keep the peace of property while restoring the jurisdiction of the Pope. The compact was a work of state as well as of devotion. It fitted theology to the stubborn facts of English ownership. That winter joy went out from palaces and parishes on rumors of a royal child. Mary, whose body had never been asked to bear the weight of a realm until late in life, felt the changes that seemed the promise of an heir. Bells rang. Te Deum was sung in chapels and halls. Letters were drafted announcing that the Queen retired to her confinement for the lying in. Month followed month, and the hope turned to silence, and then to an ache that courtiers tried to hide with kindness and ceremony. It may have been a false pregnancy, a thing physicians of the day could not explain, and that modern medicine describes with terms that carry little comfort. It mattered because an heir would have bound the settlement of faith with a line of blood. Without an heir, the settlement depended on the endurance of one woman against illness, politics, and time. Yet even in disappointment, the government kept the rhythm of rule. The navy was refitted in the Thames yards. The revenue courts pressed their claims against landlords who fenced common lands without charters. Treaties were calibrated to keep France at bay and to hold the Low Countries in amity. The bishops restored visitations to parishes long neglected by reforming administrators who had been busy at other labours. Parish wall paintings returned in places. Roods went back over chancels in others. In town after town, the people received these changes with a spectrum of feeling that runs from devotion through indifference to sullen discontent. England is a country where doctrine often goes through the motions of law, while belief moves at the pace of families. By the close of 1554 and into the early months of 1555, the scaffold and the stake would come to define the reign for generations. That belongs to the next part of the story. The part told here belongs to a restoration that Mary attempted with intelligence and courage. She recovered a crown against a plot that had the signatures of a king and a council. She steadied a capital in the face of a rebellion that marched within sight of the White Tower. She married for policy rather than for comfort, and extracted from a great empire terms that respected English law. She brought the realm back to Rome on conditions that took account of 2 decades of confiscations. She failed to give the kingdom a child. The ledger of achievement and loss already held enough to fix her in the memory of her people before the fires were lit. The law moved first. In the closing weeks of 1554 and the opening weeks of 1555, Parliament restored the jurisdiction of Rome and revived the ancient statutes against heresy. The words were old, but the world upon which they fell was new. For 2 decades, English parishes had heard the scriptures read in the vernacular, had watched rood screens come down and stone saints topple, had learned a liturgy that spoke of remembrance rather than sacrifice. Many welcomed the return of Latin rites and the authority of a single church. Many did not. The Queen trusted the pattern of statute, visitation, and example. She meant to husband a reconciliation by steady steps. The steps soon echoed to the crackle of fire. The first to die was a London pastor. John Rogers, once a collaborator with the reformer William Tyndale, had ministered to a congregation at St. Sepulchre without Newgate. He had married. He had children. In early February of 1555, he was led from Newgate jail to Smithfield. He refused to recant the doctrines he had preached. A crowd gathered in winter air that smelled of coal, smoke, and leather. The sheriff read the writ. Rogers prayed aloud. The straw and faggots caught. The onlookers later told that his wife and children watched from the edge of the throng. His death opened a calendar of martyrs that would stretch through the rain. Within weeks, another scholar preacher, Lawrence Saunders, burned at Coventry. In spring, John Hooper, deprived Bishop of Gloucester, died at a slow fire in his cathedral city. The pattern was set. Examination in consistory courts, formal degradation for those who held orders, delivery to the sheriff with a writ de heretico comburendo, a morning march to a stake set in a market square. In the autumn came the Oxford flames that entered Proverb. Nicholas Ridley, once Bishop of London, and Hugh Latimer, the former Bishop of Worcester, had been held in the Bocado prison above the North Gate. On an October morning of 1555, they were brought to a ditch by the city wall near Balliol and marshalled by aldermen and scholars. Ridley prayed with careful eloquence. Latimer, the old man who had preached to 2 kings, spoke the words that every English schoolchild would later learn from the pages of Fox. "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. God will light this day a candle in England." The bundles were lit. A contrary wind blew the first flames from Ridley and back toward Latimer. The pain was long and public. It wrote itself into the memory of a university town where many had argued that true religion could be taught with syllogism and statute and never again with smoke. The most famous of the condemned did not die until the next year. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury under Henry and Edward, lingered in prison with a pen placed before him. He signed recantations more than once. The Crown had already agreed that Rome's legate should occupy Canterbury's chair. Cardinal Reginald Pole, that learned exile who had reconciled the realm to the papacy, was to be archbishop. The political use of a public retraction by Cranmer would have been obvious to any government. Yet Mary chose a different theatre. In March of 1556, he was brought before a crowded nave in St. Mary the Virgin at Oxford and expected to read a set piece of submission. Instead, he denounced his recantations as written with his hand but not his heart and declared the Pope a usurper. He was hurried from the pulpit to the stake. Before the fire rose, he thrust the hand that had signed the papers into the blaze. Chroniclers of many persuasions agreed that he held it there a long time. The London courts of heresy were most active because London was the busiest pulpit and the most studied audience. Edmund Bonner, restored to the See of London after the first Parliament of the reign, became the face of Marian justice for a later generation that read Fox by the parish lectern. In truth, his court proceeded as heresy courts had long done, with citations, articles, and thin chances for recantation. In the provinces, bishops and commissioners followed suit. At Canterbury, at Colchester, at Lewes, at Norwich, stakes were set in market squares, where parishioners had long haggled for fish and candles. In the West Country, Exeter saw burnings. In Kent, Canterbury saw more. The numbers can be counted with an accountant's grim patience. In the 3 years from early 1555 to the last months of 1558, about 300 men and women were burned for obstinate heresy. Several dozen more died in prison. Several hundred fled abroad. Those who fled formed communities that would change English religion in ways the Queen could not foresee. The Frankfurt congregation organized itself with an order of worship that tried to blend the English prayer book with the discipline of the reformed cities. Disputes over that blend hardened into principles that English Protestants would carry back home later. In Geneva, a band of exiles gathered around John Knox and around presses that worked through long nights. From those presses would come the Geneva Bible in the next reign, with marginal notes that taught readers how to measure princes by scripture. In the final year of Mary's life, Knox published a trumpet blast against the rule of women, written in Geneva's sharp air, that condemned the queens of England and Scotland alike as rebellions against nature. The book would become a problem for Knox under Elizabeth. Under Mary, it simply added to the list of pamphlets that crossed the Channel to undermine a settlement she believed to be salvation. The Queen's own household suffered losses that altered the tone of her government. Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester and Lord Chancellor, who had been the political pillar of the Restoration, died in November of 1555. His blend of sharp law and practiced moderation had steadied the council in its first 2 years. Cardinal Pole, the architect of reconciliation, became Archbishop of Canterbury the next year. He preferred persuasion to terror, university reform to public spectacle. His temper sometimes set him at odds with more zealous agents. Yet even he could not halt a machine that parishes and councils had already set in motion. The Queen believed that to stay the hand of justice would be to betray the souls she had sworn to shepherd. In this conviction she stood like iron. Beyond the churches and courts, harvests and plagues worked their own ruin. Bad weather and disease struck in the mid-1550s. A severe influenza, the sweat that contemporaries dreaded, swept the realm in 1557 and 1558. Parish registers in towns as different as Norwich and York recorded burials that doubled and then doubled again. Grain prices rose. Poor relief in London parishes thinned. Bridewell and the Savoy hospitals, refounded or supported by the Crown, could not answer the press of need. The Queen's government attempted currency reform to cleanse the coinage of the debasements of the previous reigns. Plans were drawn in 1556 and 1557, but the Treasury lacked the silver to buy back the base coins, and the war that followed devoured what reserves remained. The reform would be left to her sister. War came as the political price of marriage. In the summer of 1557, Philip, now King of Spain upon the abdication of his father, led Habsburg armies against France and won a victory at St. Quentin. He asked his wife's council to honor the alliance. England joined the struggle. The decision was lawful under the terms of the marriage treaty and pragmatic in the eyes of men who measured England's strength by friendship with the Low Countries. It was disastrous in the eyes of those who kept their hearts in the French marches. In the first days of January of 1558, the French, under Francis of Guise, moved against Calais, England's last town on the continent, a place held since the days of Edward III. The marshes were hard with frost, and the garrison was too small. The walls that had stood through sieges in former reigns could not be manned. In 8 days the town fell. The blow was felt in every counting-house and tavern in London. Calais had been a gateway for wool and a symbol of an older imperial dream. It became a memory and a reproach. The Queen is said to have told her privy ladies that when she died, they would find Calais written on her heart. Whether the phrase is hers or a courtier's embroidery, it records a truth. The loss pierced her. Philip returned to England briefly after St. Quentin, and then departed again, to tend a dominion that stretched from the Netherlands to Naples and from Castile to the cities of the New World. His absence was a political fact. He wrote letters of endearment that a wife read with hope and a council read with calculation. In the summer of 1557, Mary believed herself again with child. The court prepared for a confinement. The months passed with no birth. The disappointment returned like a tide that washed away patience from some and spirits from many. A second phantom sealed her recognition that there would be no heir from her body. Meanwhile, the burnings continued. The names of men and women who stood by their doctrines and died for them filled broadsheets and foreign letters. Alice Driver at Ipswich, the weavers of Colchester, the Kentish men who sang psalms as they were chained. The list included more than clergy. It included artificers, labourers, widows. Some crowds jeered. Others wept. Many watched with the faces of market people whose trade had been interrupted by a ritual of state. The government did not intend spectacle for its own sake. It intended correction. The executioners and the sheriffs understood that they were meant to frighten the living more than speed the dead. If fear converts, the policy had logic. If fear hardens, the policy writes a book against itself. That book appeared after the Queen was gone. John Fox, who had studied at Oxford and fled to Strasbourg and Geneva, compiled in the early years of Elizabeth a great ledger of Protestant suffering. Acts and monuments ran to many sheets and then to many volumes, as printers added woodcuts of flames and faces and long narratives of trial and conscience. The book took the Marian years and taught a generation how to remember them. Parish churches kept a copy chained near the lectern. Children traced the lines of Latimer's last words. London apprentices learned to recite them. The Queen earned a byname she never heard and never would have recognized as fair. Yet names are facts in politics when they are repeated enough. Illness carried Mary toward her end, while her council counted the costs of war and plague. In the late autumn of 1558, she sickened at St. James's Palace. On the same day in November, Cardinal Pole died at Lambeth, the spiritual partner of her enterprise, as if the reconciliation itself were withdrawing from England in company with the woman who had made it. Her sister Elizabeth rode to the city. The council bowed and proclaimed the new queen. Bells rang. Mary's body was taken in solemn procession to Westminster, where her effigy in wax rode on the hearse, and the choir sang the old rites she had restored. A nation that had rehearsed the swing between churches now rehearsed it again. What, then, is the reckoning? Mary recovered a crown by courage and law. She reunited her realm to Rome by a compact that kept the peace of property while repairing the theology of her conscience. She used statutes long on the books to punish what the Church called heresy, and in 3 years the fires consumed about 300 lives. She married for policy and found loneliness. She backed her husband's war and lost a town that had been in English hands for 2 centuries. She attempted to repair the coinage and could not. She invested in ships and storehouses and left a navy that would serve her sister well. She refounded houses of charity and religion and saw famine and fever undo kindness. Her reign is not a single tale. It is a ledger of gains and grief written in a hand that never wavered when she thought God demanded a straight line. The story opens on the marshy plains and low hills that slope up toward the Carpathians, in a frontier world where watchtowers studied the horizon for Ottoman raiding parties and church spires marked villages pledged to rival confessions. In the late 16th century, this was royal Hungary under Habsburg rule, its diet meeting at Pressburg and its Palatine carrying the king's authority when the monarch was far away in Vienna. The great houses that anchored this landscape lived in stone and in law. Among them, the Bathories stood high, an old clan with branches in the east at Exed and in the northeast at Nyerbator, kin to princes of Transylvania and to a king of Poland who had once ridden from Vilnius to Krakow as Stephen Bathory in the year 1576. Into that web of title and expectation a girl was born in the summer of 1560, remembered by later chroniclers as Elizabeth, the daughter of George Bathory and Anna Bathory of the Exed line. The child grew in castles that smelled of beeswax and rushes, and of the marsh that lapped against the causeways of Exed. She learned the skills expected of a noblewoman in a realm where written orders held as much power as a drawn sword. Tutors taught her to read Latin prayers and German letters, as well as Hungarian, to keep accounts in a neat hand, and to correspond with stewards in a tone that admitted no hesitation. She heard sermons from Calvinist ministers, for the ex-Bathories leaned toward the Reformed confession in a kingdom divided among Catholics loyal to the Habsburg crown, Protestants scattered across towns and manors, and Unitarians whose bold arguments found patronage in Transylvania. From galleries, she watched the legal theatre of a great house, where alispans and county officers bowed, where petitions from tenants were accepted or dismissed, where the weight of a signature could lighten burdens or make them intolerable. Marriage for a daughter of such a house was an act of policy. In the spring of 1575, Elizabeth was wed to Ferenc Nadasdy in a ceremony that joined two fortunes and two networks of power. The Nadasdy family commanded wide estates on the western marches, including the stronghold of Sava, whose red brick walls and stout towers looked out over the Raba River. Ferenc, a land magnate barely out of youth when he married, would become a renowned soldier in the long Turkish War, that exhausting conflict fought from 1593 to 1606, when Habsburg armies and their Magyar allies bled to hold a frontier that ran like a scar across counties, with names that later maps would write as Győr and Veszprém and Nógrád. Letters between husband and wife, preserved in fragments in family archives, show an affectionate, if uneven partnership. She managed the manors while he campaigned. He sent news from the Danube lines and demanded greater discipline from the servants at home. In the cadence of those letters, one hears both fondness and steel. The household over which Elizabeth presided was immense. Peasants owed dues in grain and labor. Foresters guarded the oak stands and counted swine in mast years. The manorial court fined for careless fires, for fights in the alehouse, for trespass with cattle. In the great kitchen, clay ovens turned out loaves for hundreds and copper kettles simmered stews for the table of the lady and for the second table of officers and clerks. A small army of serving girls and apprentices moved in set patterns through corridors and courtyards. In that world, discipline was not merely a moral expectation, but an economic imperative. A negligent maid could spoil a batch of tallow. A thieving stable boy could ruin a string of horses. Manuals of the age, from Germany to Hungary, advised lords to correct servants swiftly and harshly. The line between correction and cruelty was drawn by custom and by the temper of those who commanded. The political map around Sava and around the northern seat of Čachtice was a map of pressure and opportunity. To the south and east, the Ottoman beylerbeyis in Buda and Eger held fortified towns and launched raids in the season when the roads were dry. To the north and west, the Habsburg administration in Pressburg and Vienna collected war taxes. summoned county levies, and issued proclamations about coinage, confessional peace, and the conduct of frontier war. The estates, the diet, and the king bargained constantly. The Palatine, the highest office in the kingdom under the monarch, mediated among magnates who guarded their prerogatives fiercely. Religion sharpened every dispute. Jesuit colleges appeared in royal towns to teach Latin and to recover souls. Calvinist synods scolded their flocks for backsliding into festivals. Pastors and priests preached in pulpits a day's walk apart to congregations that understood the politics behind every sermon. Children arrived in the Bathory and Nadesty houses. Elizabeth bore daughters named Anna, Orsolia, and Catelyn, and a son named Paul who would later inherit. These births placed the Countess in the network of godparents that bound houses to one another more tightly than written alliances. As long as Ferenc lived, the rumors that would one day drown the name of his wife were contained within the ordinary malice of village talk. Servants grumbled about punishments. Tenants whispered about the harshness of the lady at Sarvar. Such talk belonged to every manor. Ferenc died in the autumn of 1604, a veteran of the Long War carried off perhaps by a lingering illness rather than by any single wound. His widow, not yet in her mid-40s, became the sole manager of a far-flung estate that stretched from the western counties to upland holdings in what modern maps write as Slovakia. Her principal residence shifted more often to the north at Chachtis, a hilltop castle set above vineyards and orchards, with a parish church down the slope and with the administrative counties of Trenčín and Nietra near at hand. The change coincided with a lawless interval that followed the war. Veterans haunted roads. Tax collectors pressed hard to rebuild royal treasuries emptied by campaigns. Harvests that had suffered in the chill years of the Little Ice Age failed again in several seasons. In such times, the weak were easily crushed. Girls from poor families, sent to a great house as servants in hope of wages and protection, were most vulnerable of all. It is in those months and years that the accusations take on the shape that would echo for centuries. Reports reached county officers that young serving girls were vanishing from Chachtis and from satellite manors, that mothers who came to the gate to demand news were turned away, that a physician had been called too late for a maid whose body showed injuries no accident could explain. Complaints were carried to petty courts and then pushed upward, for the Countess was no petty lord and could not be touched without the sanction of the highest authority in the land. The case rose to the Palatine, Georgi Thurzo, an able magnate of the north, who had been elected to the office in the autumn of 1609 by a diet anxious to steady a kingdom still bruised by war. Thurzo had hunted with Nadesdy in better days and had dined at Bathory tables. He also held the king's commission to keep the peace and to answer to Vienna when peace was broken. The legal frame for what followed was old and precise. The Tripartitum, the early 16th century Hungarian law book that every county jurist knew by heart, granted the Palatine wide powers to investigate crimes that touched the honor of the realm. Thurzo's men took depositions in market towns and in villages within a week's walk of Chachtis. Clerks wrote down the sworn words of mothers, of serving girls who had escaped and hidden, of tradesmen who had seen bundles carried out at night, and of minor officials who feared the rage of a great lady and yet decided that fear of God was greater. The numbers began to climb beyond anything the Palatine had expected. By the time he was done, he had gathered several hundred witness statements. Many told of beatings so severe that rooms were spattered with blood. Some told of needles and knives used with premeditated cruelty. Others described winter punishments in courtyards with water poured on naked skin until the victims froze. There were also statements about food withheld until girls chewed straw and rags, about wounds smeared with ashes and vinegar to burn and to hide the smell of rot. On a winter day, near the end of the year 1610, the Palatine rode to Chachtis with a small force. He chose his hour carefully. He had already warned the most powerful of Elizabeth's kinsmen, both to avoid a feud and to ensure that when he entered the hall and found what he expected to find, he would not be accused of invention. The accounts of what happened that evening differ in detail and agree in effect. Doors were forced. A wounded girl was discovered in a room near the great chamber. Other young women were found bound. The Countess, according to Thurzo's own letters, stood on her dignity and declared herself a lady who answered to God and to no earthly judge. The Palatine made his calculation, as statesmen do. He could arrest her and haul her to Pressburg for a trial that would shake the kingdom and perhaps drag in kinsmen at the highest level. Or he could confine her at once, seize her accomplices, and promise her relatives that no public trial would stain the name of Bathory beyond repair. He chose the second course. Elizabeth Bathory was shut into an inner suite of rooms within the castle. Masonry blocked the doors, leaving apertures for air, food, and the confessor who would visit her over the next years. Her principal servants were taken to trial in early 1611 in county courts that moved with startling speed. The record of those proceedings survives in copies kept at Bitcher and in other archives. It names accomplices who confessed under questioning to procuring girls, to beating them at the lady's command, to inventing devices that made torment an art. Torture was used to extract statements. Sentences were savage. Some servants lost fingers before they lost their heads. Others were burned. The written indictments fixed numbers that would haunt history. Several witnesses spoke of 30 or 40 deaths. One spoke of 650, a figure that scholars have doubted since the 18th century, and that may reflect a boast, a rumor, or a tally book lost to time. Even the low accounts would rank the crimes among the worst known in any noble house of that century. The depositions are a grim chorus, but even in their unanimity, a careful ear hears politics. Thurzo was a Palatine who needed to satisfy both Vienna and the Hungarian estates. He could not allow a public scandal so vast that it endangered the fiction that magnates were guardians of order. He also could not allow impunity so obvious that commoners would conclude that noble blood was license. The compromise he struck was rough justice. He bricked the lady into her rooms and saw to it that her accomplices died quickly. He allowed the Bathory heirs to retain most of the estates rather than strip them for the royal fisc, a decision that calmed the Diet and reassured other great houses that the king's man would not use one case to make a precedent for wholesale confiscation. The result protected the structure of a society while telling a terrified countryside that a limit had been enforced. Around this hard core of testimony and policy grew stories that drifted far from the ledger and the judge's table. Tales that the Countess bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth appear nowhere in the 17th century records. They enter print in later centuries through compilers who preferred Gothic flourish to archival caution. The Iron Maiden, a spiked sarcophagus the size of a woman, belongs more to a curator's fantasy cabinet than to a Hungarian castle inventory. What the contemporary papers do show is horrifying without embroidery. Beatings, burnings, cold, cutting, starvation, a mistress who delighted in command, and a household that learned to obey in ways that broke bodies. The power to harm came from rank and from a system that left the poorest with no recourse, but the pity of neighbors and the courage of a handful of clerks and officers who decided to write down what they saw. Elizabeth Bathory did not leave Chachtis again in life. The guards recorded that she grew thin and then swollen, that she raved on some nights and sat silent on others, that she scolded even the women who brought her bread. In the late summer of 1614, they found her dead in her room. The first burial was local, in the church below the castle. The protests of villagers who did not wish her interred among their dead led the family to remove the body. perhaps to the Bathory crypt at Exed, which was destroyed in later centuries when the Marsh and War took the castle down to its foundations. There is no grave one can point to with certainty. The uncertainty suits a legend that prefers a haunted name to a stone. The world that made the case also made the argument that followed it. Some early apologists suggested that enemies had framed a Protestant noblewoman in a kingdom where confessional rivalry and Habsburg centralization were tightening the screws on magnates. Others noted that the Palatine had every reason to be cautious and every means to find the safest truth. Modern historians who have read the testimonies in the original copies at Baicha and in the Trencsén County books acknowledge errors, exaggerations, and the distorting presence of torture, and yet conclude that the scale of violence cannot be explained away. The legend of bathing in blood is romance. The reality of murdered girls is a fact. A final note belongs to the economy of fear. The late 16th and early 17th centuries in Central Europe were seasons of scarcity, frontier war, and superstition. Witch trials burned through German lands. Plague visited market towns without warning. Bands of discharged soldiers marauded when pay was late. In such a climate, a great house could become a fortress not only against the Turk or the taxman, but against scrutiny. Elizabeth Bathory's name became synonymous with cruelty because her crimes were committed where law had to struggle for entry. That law finally entered under the seal of a Palatine who chose the path that stabilized a kingdom while denying the public the trial it might have demanded. The price of that choice is the fog that still hangs over numbers and over motives. The clarity that remains is enough. A countess with lineage that reached to kings built a reign of terror inside her own walls and was stopped only when the state decided that even a great name has a boundary. The case that Palatine Gheorghe Thurzo assembled against the Lady of Chartisy was built on paper before it was sealed with stone. His commissioners moved through market towns and villages, swearing peasants and tradesmen to tell all they had seen or heard. The clerks wrote in a formula learned from the Tripartitum, the early 16th century law book that trained every county jurist in the kingdom. They recorded the names of girls who had entered service and not returned, the days on which a cart creaked out of the castle gate at dusk, the nights on which a light burned in a loft where no one was permitted to sleep. By the time winter came on in the year 1610, the Palatine had gathered well over 300 depositions. There was a rhythm to these grim declarations. They began with the oath, moved through the name of the deponent, and ended with a description of a body, or the absence of a body. The core witnesses were the people of the household, men and women whose lives ran along the corridors of the fortress and the courtyards of the manors. Some were named by the clerks as Dorothea Sentes, remembered as Dorka, a housekeeper who managed keys and girls with equal severity, and Ilona Joe, a senior servant who enforced the ladies' orders in the rooms where no steward was welcome. There was a dwarf known in the papers as Fico, whose small frame and quick hands made him useful to chores and to cruelties alike. There were also grooms, kitchen boys, laundresses, and visiting tradesmen who spoke of blood on flagstones and of bundles carried to the orchard under darkness. With each account the pattern sharpened. A girl made a mistake at a task, a hem sewn poorly, a jug dropped on the stair. She was stripped and beaten with rods until skin split. If she cried, water was poured on her in winter, and she was set in a draught until the water froze on her body. If she fainted, the servants were ordered to revive her so that the punishment could resume. Other depositions told of needles and knives, of wounds packed with ashes and vinegar so that the pain would bite deeper and disguise the smell. One woman swore that she had seen the lady hold a candle under a girl's armpits and at her mouth. Another reported that she had been ordered to smear honey on a bound servant and leave her near the kennels so that insects would feast. A physician was said to have been summoned to treat a maid whose flesh had been torn by pincers. He made a poultice and left quickly. On another day, a girl disappeared. The physician did not return. The house accounts showed purchases of linen and candles as any household would, but also sudden orders for quicklime and for the digging of pits. The most chilling aspect of the testimony is how domestic it remains. The murders were not the work of a solitary sadist in a tower, but of a hierarchy organized like a kitchen or a wardrobe. Orders were given. Tasks were assigned. Servants learned their roles. The lady's authority flowed through the same channels that brought in wood and grain, and that sent out finished cloth. This is why the law could not easily enter. A great house was a private jurisdiction. Its courts fined peasants for trespass and punished servants for theft. Its gatekeepers admitted or refused petitioners at the lady's pleasure. When a poor mother came to ask for a daughter who had not written home, she met an usher and a housekeeper, not a magistrate. Her grief had to climb a ladder of officials and favors before it might reach a palatine. The palatine's descent upon Chachtisa in the last days of that winter is described in letters that carry the feel of haste. Thurzo wrote that he feared delay would mean the disappearance of evidence and the intimidation of witnesses. He also feared a collision with the most powerful of the Bathory kin, men whose displeasure could turn a legal case into a feud that disrupted the fragile balance between Vienna and Pressburg. Thus, the late-night entry, the forced doors, and the discovery of wounded girls in rooms too near the great chamber to be ignored. Thus also the immediate decision to confine the lady to her inner apartments and to take her principal servants to a public court, while sparing the kingdom the spectacle of a noblewoman on trial for crimes that would stain a whole order. The trials that followed at Bitche and in neighboring jurisdictions moved with a speed that reveals both the shock to the authorities and their wish to close the matter. Torture was used on the servants as the law allowed. They confessed their parts. They named one another and the lady who had commanded them. Sentences were severe and swift. The men were beheaded. The women were burned. The records specify the removal of hands in some cases before the final stroke, a grim arithmetic that measured complicity in fingers and in fire. Those proceedings left historians with the numbers that have fueled the legend. Several witnesses spoke of dozens of deaths. One claimed to have kept count as 650. The last number has been doubted by scholars since the 18th century and probably reflects a rumor or a terror magnified by retelling. But even the lower totals, which modern historians judge most plausible, place the count of dead far above the ordinary crimes of an ordinary age. Why did a state that assembled so strong a case stop short of the full public trial of the Countess? The answer lies in the politics of a frontier kingdom and in the calculations of a palatine who wished to preserve confidence in the law without provoking a crisis among magnates. A show trial of a Bathory would have excited Protestant and Catholic factions in equal measure, since the Countess had been raised in a Calvinist household but had kin loyal to Rome. It would have invited Vienna to take a stronger hand in Hungarian affairs under the pretext of punishing a scandal. It would have signaled to every great house that their private jurisdictions might be open to public inspection. Thurzo's compromise preserved order at the price of transparency. It allowed him to write to the king that justice had been done, while assuring the estates that the dignity of a noble house would not be dragged through a capital that delighted in gossip. The confinement of Elizabeth Bathory within the castle was both punishment and erasure. Walls were thickened, and doors were bricked while leaving small apertures for food and air, and the words of a confessor. She is said to have raged at her guards, and then to have fallen into long silences. There were winters when the wind sang through the stone, and summers when heat and flies made the rooms a penance. Couriers carried letters to Vienna and Pressburg. The Palatine returned to his larger tasks. The accounts of the household show that the lady's table cost little by the end, a line of figures that speaks of a living tomb. In the late summer of 1614, the guards found her dead, her body stiff and her face turned to the wall. She was buried first in the parish church and then removed, perhaps to Ext. War, marsh, and time have effaced the grave. Legend grew in the vacuum left by that erasure. The earliest tales that she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her beauty do not appear in the 17th century papers. They surface in the next century, among compilers who repeated stories without the discipline of archives, and they swell in the 19th century when readers everywhere fell in love with the Carpathians as a stage for terror. The Iron Maiden, that human-shaped casket studded within by spikes, is an invention of collectors and showmen rather than a device listed in any Hungarian inventory of the age. Yet the myths are not harmless ornament. They soften the hard truth by making it unbelievable. The reality preserved in the depositions and in the orders of the Palatine is squalid and methodical. It is the steady use of power to hurt the powerless within a household whose gates kept out the law. Even the question of victims shows how the legend distorts. The earliest wave of girls were peasant servants drawn from villages on the Nitra and Var rivers, sent to manors in hope of wages and safety. That is why the first rumors traveled through markets rather than through courts. Some later accounts claim that daughters of minor nobles also disappeared into the castle. If that is true, it would explain the sudden vigor with which local authorities pressed complaints upward in the final years. When a county's small gentry saw their own at risk, the words in petitions changed from whispers to ultimatums. Whether or not that second circle of victims existed, the first circle is sure enough. The dead were the daughters of the poor. The afterlife of the case reaches into law, literature, and national memory. Jurists in the 18th century and the 19th century debated whether Thurzo had acted within the fullness of his office, or whether he had spared an aristocrat a trial that a commoner would have faced. Romantic writers turned the countess into a Gothic emblem, a female counterpart to the Wallachian impaler, whose name became a novel. The countess's story traveled into chapbooks, and then into modern entertainments that play with fear and with the attraction of the forbidden. In our own time, visitors climb the hill to the castle ruins above the village and look out across vineyards to the whitewashed church, and guides tell versions of the tale that mix courtroom fragments with campfire inventions. Meanwhile, historians sit in reading rooms in Bratislava, Budapest, and Vienna and compare copies of 17th century sheets, measuring words that were written hurriedly by clerks who could not have dreamed what work those words would be asked to do. There remains the unsparing question of motive. Was Elizabeth Bathory a sadist who found pleasure in pain for its own sake? Was she a mistress who believed that fear produced obedience and who allowed habit to become horror? Was she driven by the sourness of widowhood and the strain of managing estates in a hard time? The papers cannot answer finally. They show only a pattern of harm, the means to inflict it, and the failure of ordinary checks to stop it until the highest magistrate stepped in. She lived in an era of confessed brutality. Punishments in village courts were public and theatrical. The Ottoman raids across the frontier normalized the sight of bodies on stakes and impalements in marketplaces. Soldiers returned to farms with heads full of war. In such a climate, a heart that inclined to cruelty had a ready school. The manner in which the story has been told across 4 centuries may say as much about us as about her. Early modern writers folded the case into confessional polemic, each side hinting that the crimes reflected on its enemies. Enlightenment compilers treated her as a caution about noble privilege. 19th century romantics turned her into a dark mirror for a Europe that loved the sublime and the terrible in mountain passes and ruined towers. 20th century popular culture made her into a figure of lurid vampirism because that made the story simpler to sell. To return to the depositions is to turn away from that carnival and to face something quieter and worse. The murder of girls by those who owned their hours and their bodies is not supernatural. It is human. If a history has any duty here, it is to restore proportions. The Palatine's compromise did what he intended. It steadied a realm and kept a scandal within bounds. It also left a gap that legend eagerly filled. Within that gap, we must set the few things that cannot be pulled loose. In the years after the death of Ferenc Nadasdi, and before the winter raid of 1610, scores of young women died at or near Chachtise. Their names are largely lost because the poor move through archives like shadows. Their deaths were the consequence of command exercised within walls that the law approached with deference. The woman who ordered those harms was confined until she died in the summer of 1614. The rest is the noise of centuries. She entered the world in the summer of 1734 at the Ribera Palace on the north bank of the Tagus, a princess in a capital still rebuilding the habits of empire after the 17th century wars. Her grandfather João V had filled Lisbon with music and marble, with Italian singers in the royal chapel and with carloads of Brazilian gold that bought Roman architects and Neapolitan stuccoers. In that court, Maria Francisca Isabel Josefa de Bragança learned letters and piety, Latin prayers and Portuguese law, and the careful courtesy that oiling the wheels of a monarchy requires. She was a conscientious child with a gravity that charmed confessors and made diplomats predict a steady sovereign if the crown should ever come to her. The ground shifted under that palace in November of 1755, when an earthquake that people could not measure except by terror broke the city on All Saints' Day. Churches fell, candles tipped, fire ran with the wind and the tide. In the long bitter weeks that followed, the king's minister, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the future Marquis of Pombal, stood in smoke and ash and rebuilt an order from ruin. He drove pilings into the riverbed. He platted the Besa in rational squares. He raised facades that shook with new anti-seismic frames the carpenters called gaiolas. He also made himself the hammer of policy. He expelled the Jesuits in 1759. He broke the old clans of high nobility after the Tavera affair in 1758 and sent heads and coats of arms to the block. He strangled monopolies and then created others, the great trading companies for Maranhão and Grão-Pará and for Pernambuco and Paraíba. He clipped the claws of an inquisitorial apparatus that had burned hot in earlier ages and replaced it with a state censorship that answered to his desk. Lisbon bore his stamp on stone and on statute. Maria grew to womanhood under that minister's canopy, yet kept a conscience not his. In May of 1760 she married her paternal uncle, Pedro, a match that kept the Braganza line concentrated and that gave her a partner of mild temper and unambitious habit. The union was affectionate, productive, and politically convenient. Children arrived with regular rhythm. José, Prince of Brazil, was born in 1761. Maria Ana in 1761 as well, a twin who died young. João, the boy who would one day govern as Prince Regent and as King, was born in 1767. Mariana Vitoria came in 1768. The births tied noble houses across the peninsula with baptisms and godparent bonds in chapels from Mafra to Evora. When King José I died in February of 1777, the crown descended to his eldest daughter. Maria became the first queen regnant in the history of Portugal. She chose as her style Maria the Pious, and the court called her so with approval. On her first day she wrote a sentence that told all Portugal the weather would change. It announced that the king was dead and the minister fallen. The viradeira, the turning of the tide, had arrived. The Marquis of Pombal was dismissed and ordered to present himself for inquiries. He wrote defenses that mixed statistics and scorn and retired to the town from which he took his title. In 1781 he was judged formally and forbidden the capital. He died the next year. His buildings and reforms remained. His shadow on policy did not. The early years of Maria's reign reveal the mind of a governor who wanted moderation after a generation of iron. She did not dismantle the new bias or the modern ministries. She did soften the punishments meted out in the Tavera case, allowing exiles to return and confiscations to be reviewed. She restored a measure of dignity to noble houses that had been driven from court, and she reopened convents whose doors had been nailed by Pombal's men. She called jurists to balance royal prerogative with the old municipal privileges in towns that still cherished medieval charters. She disliked secret societies, whatever their creed, and forbade Masonic lodges. She was devout, sometimes severe in matters of doctrine, and yet inclined to the Enlightenment in its quieter forms, the academies, the botanical gardens, the studies of tides and barometers, the classification of plants along the subtropical banks of the Tagus. Her greatest institutional legacy from those early years was a school for the mind of the nation. In 1779, she and her ministers founded the Royal Academy of Sciences of Lisbon, a learned society that met in rooms not far from the Rossio, and that printed proceedings on everything from hydraulic works to the design of bridges, from mining in the Beira Alta to inoculation against smallpox. The Academy's first members read papers on improving the salt pans of Setúbal, on straightening interior roads toward the Spanish frontier, and on the teaching of mathematics at the University of Coimbra, which Pombal had reformed with a modern curriculum of physics and chemistry in 1772. Under Maria, the laboratories stayed open and the syllabuses matured. The Queen liked the smell of ink and the sound of facts turned to use. She also built in stone for God and for memory. In the upper city, she raised the Basilica da Estrela, the great white church on a hilltop facing the river's long light. It was a votive offering she had vowed upon the birth of her son José, and its construction stretched from 1779 into 1790. The basilica's dome broke the skyline with a confidence that made travelers compare it to Roman churches. Inside, marbles from Arabida and Italy lay in geometric elegance, and beneath the nave, she placed the royal tomb she would one day occupy. At Queluz, a summer palace of rococo gardens and gilded salons, she presided over concerts and small councils, preferring the gentler air upriver to the draughts of the rebuilt Ribeira. Foreign policy declared itself quickly, because empires far from Lisbon tugged at the hem of every Portuguese monarch. In the South Atlantic, the Spanish crown pressed old claims on the sandbar at Colonia do Sacramento and on islands along the southern Brazilian coast. In the spring and summer of 1777, a Spanish squadron seized Santa Catarina with alarming ease. The incident was contained by diplomacy. In October of that year, the first Treaty of San Ildefonso between Portugal and Spain worked a hard exchange. Portugal acknowledged Spanish sovereignty over Colonia on the far bank of the Rio de la Plata. Spain recognized Portuguese control over vast hinterlands long settled by Luso-Brazilian colonists, and Santa Catarina returned to Portuguese hands. The following year, the Treaty of El Pardo settled questions on the African coast and in the Gulf of Guinea. These instruments were not triumphs. They were fences mended after decades of raids and countermarches in South America, placing lines on maps where cattle trails and river reeds had decided matters before. The economy at home and across the Atlantic demanded another kind of fence mending. The torrent of Brazilian gold that had filled Lisbon in the first half of the century was slowing to a stream. The derrama, the royal tax that sought to meet quotas when mines produced less, became a word of dread in the mining towns of Minas Gerais. In 1785, the Queen signed a charter that restricted manufacturing in Brazil in order to protect looms and workshops in the metropolis, reflecting the mercantilist gospel that had long guided Iberian fleets. The decision pleased Lisbon merchants and angered Brazilian craftsmen. 4 years later, the mines boiled with talk. In the spring of 1789, colonial officials in Villa Rica, the modern Ouro Preto, uncovered a conspiracy that had taken the name of Inconfidencia. It was a web of lawyers, officers, priests, and poets who had read French pamphlets and the news from Philadelphia, and who imagined a republic in the mountains beyond the reach of the royal customs men. The plot dissolved under interrogation. The only conspirator executed was a dentist and dragoon named Joaquim José da Silva Xavier, called Tiradentes, who died on a scaffold in April of 1792. His body was quartered and his head raised on a pike, a medieval lesson thrust into an age that fancied itself modern. The Queen approved measures that promised order. Her conscience did not stretch to rebellion. The court calendar in those years alternated between ceremony and sorrow. In May of 1786, her husband, Pedro III, a gentleman who had accepted the title of king consort so that her sovereignty would carry a comfortable symmetry, died at Ajuda. The Queen withdrew into a grief that startled courtiers by its depth and duration. In the spring of 1788, her eldest son, José, Prince of Brazil, contracted smallpox and died before he had reached his late 20s. Flags hung at half-mast over the warships moored at the Terreiro do Passo. Musicians put away their scores. The Queen's confessor and spiritual advisor, whose counsel had been a steady lantern in a conscientious mind, died soon after. In the cafes around the Rocio and in the Jesuitless colleges, men spoke of a shadow falling over Pacho da Ajuda that no architect could draw away. The shadow grew darker when the French Revolution tore Europe's nerves. The Queen had taken pleasure in court entertainments described in the Gazette de France and had bought silk woven in Lyon's looms. Now printed sheets arrived with reports of the fall of the Bastille in July of 1789, of the civil constitution of the clergy in 1790, of the flight to Varennes in 1791, and of the trial of a king. In January of 1793, the news reached Lisbon that Louis XVI had been executed in Paris. Contemporary letters record that upon hearing it, Maria cried aloud and took to her chapel, convinced that God had loosed the world from its moorings. She was not alone. Courts from Naples to Vienna shuddered. But in Lisbon the reaction carried a particular intensity, as if the murder of a consecrated monarch were a blow against the sacramental idea that had sanctified her own anointing at the cathedral. Physicians were summoned discreetly. Among them was a man famous for attending another sovereign in distress. Francis Willis, the English doctor who had treated King George III, was consulted in 1792 and again in the years that followed. He recommended gentleness, music, ordered days, and the removal of sharp shocks. Ministers attempted to shield the Queen from the worst prints and dispatches, which in an age of packets and gossips was impossible. Reports from Brazil of the Minas conspiracy, from Trás-os-Montes of food riots after bad harvests, from the frontiers of the Spanish War stirred her anxieties. Courtiers observed bouts of weeping and dread of damnation. There were days when she interrogated confessors with such scrupulousness that they begged her to rest and accept absolution. There were mornings when she refused to sign the simplest warrants, and nights when she woke attendants crying that the floor under the palace had opened and that souls would fall. Yet the machinery of state still ran with a steadiness that speaks to the durability of institutions she had guarded. The Royal Academy printed treatises on agronomy and navigation. The Treasury counted customs dues from Brazilian sugar. Angolan slaves sadly trafficked still in that decade. and the tobacco monopolies that underwrote fleets. The navy refitted ships in the arsenal and loaded cannon for convoys across seas where privateers hunted. The Casa da India and the Junta do Comercio wrote tables that matched ships to bills and made the outward flow of goods answer the inward flow of coin. The university at Coimbra sent physicians into the interior to inoculate against smallpox, and municipal councils in Porto and Evora passed ordinances to clean fountains and repair paving stones. The Queen had asked for order and for diligence. Her ministers supplied both, while asking one another how long her hand would remain steady on the pen. By the year 1792, the answer was clear enough for a decision that no court undertakes lightly. In early autumn, a decree named her second son, João, Prince Regent, to exercise the powers of the crown because the Queen's health did not permit the attention to affairs that government required. It was a kind legal phrasing for a sorrow that the court already knew. João was an earnest man with the habit of prayer and the patience to sit long in council. He had learned from his mother the value of balance, and from his grandfather the gravity of rank. He also learned swiftly that the world would not give him time. Across the Pyrenees, the French Republic marched with drums and artillery. To the east, the Spanish Bourbons would soon turn from allies to enemies in a small war that would take a slice of Portugal. To the south, the Brazilian coast waited like a chessboard of harbors and customs houses for orders that would keep an empire together with paper and with ships. The story of exile and empire belongs to the next part. What belongs here is the portrait of a queen who began in conscientious moderation, who dismissed a minister without dismantling a state, who founded an academy that gave Portugal a new voice in the Republic of Letters, who raised a white church on a hill and filled it with prayer, who traded pieces of far frontiers to keep peace with a neighbor always stronger on land, who tried to husband a colonial economy in an age of restlessness, and who was broken by a cascade of griefs and by the shudder of a revolutionary age. Maria the Pious was not a tyrant. She was a sovereign who held fast to the old idea that a crown is a sacrament, and when that idea was beheaded in Paris, something in her broke that no physician could mend. News traveled faster than armies in that age, and in the autumn of 1807, the worst news in Europe ran on every road into Lisbon. In Paris, the Emperor of the French had signed with the Spanish court the secret agreement that modern historians call the Treaty of Fontainebleau, a map drawn in a cabinet that proposed to carve Portugal into obedient pieces. A French corps under General Jean Andoche Junot crossed the Pyrenees, hurried through a Spain that would soon learn the cost of its alliance, and drove hard for the Tagus. The government of Portugal faced a choice that no royal council relishes: stay and be forced into a vassal's peace, or sail and keep the crown alive somewhere beyond the reach of French cannon. The old alliance with England provided the hinge. British ships stood off the river mouth, their captains in brisk conversation with the Portuguese ministers and with the British envoy, a viscount whose dispatches pressed the case for flight. In the last days of that November, with Junot's vanguard already on the approaches to the capital, the royal family and its court descended to the quays. The crowd on the water steps saw a sight no European city had ever seen. A monarchy embarked wholesale. The Queen, Maria I, her son, the Prince Regent João, her daughters and daughters-in-law, her grandchildren, chamberlains, confessors, librarians, musicians, physicians, and clerks by the score, crates of tapestries, the crown jewels, archives bound in leather, the files of ministries, harpsichords and altarpieces, collections of shells and seeds for a gardener's pleasure, a hospital's worth of medicines, and the practical goods of kitchens and stables. It was a state in flight. The convoy that weighed anchor under the protection of the Royal Navy counted in dozens of hulls and in thousands of souls. Storms in the Atlantic scattered the fleet and pushed ships far from their plotted courses. The Queen, already fragile, endured a passage that any healthy traveler would have called cruel. The Prince Regent read papers at a makeshift desk and consulted with British officers about convoy discipline. On shore, Junot entered Lisbon and found the nest empty. He would write that he had come to seize a monarchy but had captured only the chairs. In late January of 1808, the leading ships of the Portuguese fleet reached Salvador da Bahia, the old sugar port perched above the Bay of All Saints. There, in rooms hastily arranged in the governor's palace, the Prince Regent signed an alvará that did more to change the Atlantic economy than any decree issued in Lisbon for a century. He opened Brazilian ports to all friendly nations. The monopoly that had long restricted Brazil to trade through the Portuguese metropolis was ended by a flourish of the pen at the edge of a tropical harbor. English merchants read the text with a smile and began to plan warehouses. Brazilian planters and shopkeepers crowded the squares, shouting vivas to a prince-ship that had brought prosperity with its arrival. The fleet sailed on to Rio de Janeiro and entered Guanabara Bay in the first weeks of March. Cannon saluted from the forts at the bar. Drums beat. The Viceroy's palace on the Praça do Carmo became the Paço Real and then the Paço do Rio. Overnight, a colonial seat became an imperial capital. The transformation was not only ceremonial. Institutions sprouted like mango trees after a rain. In the spring of 1808, the Crown created the Royal Printing Press, the Imprensa Regia, and soon afterward issued the first numbers of the Gazeta do Rio de Janeiro, the official newspaper that taught a port city how to read itself as a capital. That same year, the Banco do Brasil was established to steady the flow of credit in a world where new trade would require new paper. A botanical garden took root on land along the lagoon, a place for acclimatizing spices and for the royal taste in palms and alleys. Medical schools opened at Salvador and at Rio to train surgeons for a realm spread along thousands of miles of coast. Within 2 years, the Real Academia Militar, the Royal Military Academy, began to educate officers and engineers whose mathematics would be turned to bridges and to artillery. Maria's condition had not mended. It had worsened before the voyage, and the sea had added its own strain. In Salvador and then in Rio, she was settled under the careful eyes of attendants in the Carmo convent that stood beside the palace. In a city that marveled to see a crowned court in tropical light, she became a rumor heard through shutters. Travelers reported that at night, cries could be heard from the wings of the convent where she lived, dread of damnation, and a cascade of prayers. Then a piano's careful notes in the early hours when sleep would not come. There were days when she refused to change garments or to suffer a physician to enter. There were better days when she asked after the poor and heard with attention the reports of almoners. The people of Rio, a city not shy to invent names, began to call her Maria, a Luca, Maria the Mad, an epithet that could be cruel and that could also carry a kind of pity in a culture that has always reserved tenderness for the unlucky. If the Queen's rooms were quiet, the council chamber was anything but. The Prince Regent met British envoys, officers from the squadrons that guarded the South Atlantic, merchants who pressed for permissions, Brazilian magistrates who wanted the Chancery to honor towns that had long been neglected by a distant metropolis, and clergymen who sought to adjust the old balances among dioceses on a continent now hosting a royal chapel. Posters went up in Rio in 1809 and 1810 with rules about street lighting and sanitation, a small revolution in a city where bay breezes carried the scent of tar and oranges through narrow lanes. Rio began to look like a capital not only because it hosted ministers, but because it summoned masons to straighten streets and carters to haul away, refuse, and musicians to tune for evenings that now served a court. The scale of the change became plain when peace returned to Europe. With Napoleon defeated and diplomats gathered at Vienna in 1814, the question of the Portuguese crown's residence moved from gossip to agenda. Should a monarchy that had fled to keep itself alive now recross the ocean? The answer reached for a compromise that turned an expedient into a constitution. In December of 1815, the Prince Regent declared Brazil a kingdom co-equal with Portugal and the Algarves, and he joined them all in a single entity with a careful name, the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. The Queen remained the sovereign in law. Her son remained the regent who acted in her name and signed the instruments that explained a new political geography to a world that had never imagined that a European throne could sit so far west for so long. For the Queen herself, the last months were a dwindling of strength. The air of Rio could be tender in the evening, the harbour like a sheet of beaten copper at sunset, but the humidity of summer pressed on the lungs, and even the royal rooms could be as hot as ovens in January. In those months she sometimes asked to be carried to a balcony where she could see the bay, ships riding at anchor like sleeping animals. In late summer of 1815 she was present by intention, if not by mind, when the kingdom was declared. In early spring of 1816 the attendants found her failing. On a March night she died in the Carmo convent that had kept her company through the Brazilian years. She was 81 by the count of baptismal records and royal almanacs. The city dressed itself in black. Processions moved slowly down streets still dusty with recent improvements. The British guns in the bay fired formal salutes for a sovereign whose room had been within earshot of sailors' songs for nearly a decade. The Prince Regent became King João VI. Orders were issued for the careful removal of the Queen's body to Lisbon, when the Atlantic would allow a voyage of such cargo. In time she came home to the basilica she had built in the years of energy and hope, the white church on the hill where skilled masons had laid black and white marble in clean patterns, and where sunlight pools on winter mornings. The tomb says little, the city says the rest. What was accomplished in exile and what was lost? A monarchy survived by leaning into the wind and letting the Atlantic carry it. Brazil was transformed by the presence of a court and by the decrees that court issued. The opening of ports broke habits that had for centuries rendered colonists clients of a metropolis that too often could not deliver the goods it promised. Banks, presses, schools, and arsenals turned a provincial town into a governing city. Those changes prepared Brazil for a future that would arrive a few years after the Queen's death, when her grandson Pedro would declare a sovereignty of his own in Rio. For Portugal, the court's long absence weakened institutions at home and produced resentments that would shape the politics of the 1820s. Yet it also preserved the Braganza line and allowed Lisbon to re-enter Europe as the capital of a kingdom that had kept its head above water when the continent nearly drowned. Maria the Pious did not master events in those last years. She endured them and gave them a legitimacy that even an ailing sovereign can confer. Her name, spoken with pity by some and with respect by others, became attached to a period when a crown proved that it could float and yet not be washed away. The ships that carried her to Brazil in that winter of 1807 were instruments of survival. The institutions founded under her style in the years that followed were instruments of reinvention. If there is a single lesson in her exile, it is that a state can sometimes save itself by leaving home and by returning only when the map is redrawn and the sea is calm again. Ranavalona of Imerina, an island kingdom on the edge of empires. The highlands of Madagascar rise from rice terraces and red earth to a spine of hills where morning mists cling to eucalyptus and the air cools after the equatorial Sunday. There, on a ridge called Analamanga, the Marina kings built their wooden palaces and stockaded towns. Antananarivo, the city of the thousand, took shape along that ridge in the late 18th century, a royal seat watching roads that ran like nerves to every valley. The hill of Ambohimanga, sacred with earthworks and stone gates, lay to the northeast and held the bones of ancestors and the memory of a statesman king named Andrianampoinimarina, who, in the years around 1790 and 1810, stitched quarrelsome chiefdoms into a single spine of authority. He spoke in Kabari, those long orations that are part law and part poetry, and promised the marina that the sea would one day be their rice fields. His son Radama pushed outward along that promise with muskets and treaties. Radama I became the most formidable ruler in the island's history to that date. In 1817, he signed at Tamatave a compact with British envoys that pledged, on paper and with hedged sincerity, to curb the export of slaves in exchange for gunpowder, instructors, and recognition. Captain James Hastie, an officer with a gift for languages and for tact, took up residence as the British agent at court and became a friend to a ruler eager for foreign arts. London Missionary Society men followed the first Royal Navy sloops, setting up a printing press that turned out a catechism and then a grammar in a Latin script adapted to Malagasy sounds. Schools spread through the capital and into satellite towns. Artisans experimented with European looms and ironwork. At the same time, marina regiments moved down from the highlands through the eastern forests to Toamasina, the port Europeans called Tamatave, and along the western plain to Mahajanga, claiming taxes and captives from Sakalava and Betsimisaraka polities that had once dealt with ships as independent brokers. The court Radama commanded was a world of hearth, smoke, and rank. The king's officers slept near the palisades, with spears stacked and muskets oiled. Inside the royal compounds, the women's palace held wives of many ranks, Vadinandriana, wives of the noble. Among them was a young woman known as Ramavo, a kinswoman of a rival line whom Andrianampoinimarina had spared in his day and placed under royal protection. In a story the Highland elders liked to tell, the king had marked the girl's fate when she was a child, saying that her path led upward if she were prudent and fierce. Ramavo grew to womanhood with a composure that made attendants notice. In the years when Radama gathered wives to anchor alliances and to demonstrate the abundance demanded of a sovereign, Ramavo was among those he raised to the inner circle. She had no living children. She learned the rhythms of court, the value of silence, and the leverage of ritual. Succession in Imarina was custom before it was law, and custom left room for fear. Radama favored a nephew, a boy of good mind educated in the new schools, and messengers taught officers' messes to speak the boy's name with respect. When the king died suddenly in the dry season of 1828, Antananarivo was a maze of whispers. The keepers of the royal talismans, the Sampi that embodied ancestral powers, stirred. Senior officers remembered old promises and new resentments. In the women's palace, Ramavo moved with the speed that in those hills counted as wisdom. She sought the guardians of the Sampi and the captains who commanded the palace gates and the regiments of the Vohitsara quarter. They looked through lineage and listened to the note in her voice. The argument she offered was half theology and half police work. The spirits of the ancestors, she said, had not yet yielded the country to a child with teachers from across the sea. The marina should have a ruler who knew the old songs and the price of disobedience. In the nights that followed, the capital saw what every court sees when a throne stands between factions. Doorkeepers chose sides. Gongs sounded in the compounds of high officers. The planned investiture of the nephew dissolved. Men loyal to Ramavo seized the granary keys and the armories. The keepers of Iklimalaza and the other great Sampi declared that the omen pointed in one direction only. At dawn, the drums on Analamanga beat the summons. Before noon, Ramavo had become Ranavalona, the name that meant protected by the ancestral shades. She promised amnesty with one breath and ordered purges with the next. The faction that had backed the boy heir was broken in a day that marina chroniclers would speak of only by allusion, because lists of the dead carry a sting even when time has passed. The new queen stood on a dais of smooth boards in the court and addressed the assembled officers and townsmen. Her Kabari pledged to keep the land as the ancestors had kept it, to honor the talismans and the tombs, and to be unafraid. Her first decisions traced a philosophy that would define a reign. She kept the forms Radama had borrowed from Europe when they served her, and cast them off when they threatened the center. The schools did not close at once. The presses did not fall silent in the first months. British officers still walked the palace courtyards, but the extravagance of foreign advisors was clipped, and the confidence of their hosts was shaken by the quick deaths of allies. The Queen reinstated with vigor the deep mariner practices that bound obedience to the crown. Phanum Poana, the corvée of labor owed to the sovereign, was demanded with new intensity to repair roads and to raise new fortifications on the eastern forest routes. The Fokonolona, the village assemblies that had always mattered in the highlands, were reminded that they must deliver quotas of rice and soldiers when the cavalry called. The guardians of the Sampi regained their old places in the palace ranks, and omens were watched with attention no foreigner could understand. She chose her ministers shrewdly. The first among them for a time was Andrea Mihaja, a noble of the inner circle whose counsel had helped her to the throne. He fell within 2 years, broken by suspicion and by competing claims to the Queen's favor. In his place, a hard soldier named Rainiharo rose, a man of the guard whose command of troops and of the plain speech of the barracks steadied the throne. He would become prime minister and consort, a partner both in policy and in palace. Under these men, and under the Queen's eye, the regiments were drilled, and the stockades along the eastern frontier were strengthened. Columns marched down to Toamasina and up again in alternating seasons, an exhausting rhythm that taught the highland state to breathe with the sea breeze and the monsoon. The coast was not only geography, it was a ledger. Before the British Treaty of 1817, slavers had bought men and women along the island's fringes for shipment to islands of sugar to the west. That traffic did not disappear because a paper in Tamatave said so. It thinned. It diverted to creeks and inlets beyond the eyes of frigates. It invited collusion from chiefs whose people had been raided by Highland soldiers. Under Radama, the treaty had already turned marina expansion into a tax regime that collected customs and sought to replace the slave trade with trade in hides and rice. Under Ranavalona, the calculus grew harsher. The Queen saw the eastern ports as doors through which missionaries, consuls, and naval officers might step with demands dressed as advice. She placed trusted men at those doors. She fined and expelled British residents when it suited her. She encouraged Highland traders and curtailed foreign ones. The message was simple: Madagascar would be an island again. At court, she remained both visible and mysterious. The wooden palaces on Analamanga, with their pitched roofs and their galleries carved with rosettes and braids, hosted audiences in which the Queen sat on a platform while petitioners prostrated themselves and spoke. The etiquette was elaborate. The speeches were long. The Queen could be unexpectedly charming when a supplicant pleased her, and instantly cold when a noble presumed. She kept a small circle fed with gifts, and kept that circle in fear with sudden punishments. She visited the tombs at Ambohimanga with the solemnity of a priest and the alertness of a general, because a pilgrimage on that hill was also a statement that the state flowed from the ancestors and from the woman who spoke in their name. Across the early 1830s, the projects of a different modernity appeared in the Highlands, this time not as the gift of mission presses, but as the work of a Frenchman whose fortunes would be entwined with the crown. Jean Laborde, a shipwrecked adventurer with a talent for machines, made his way to Antananarivo and won the Queen's interest with demonstrations of casting and carpentry. At her order, he founded at Mantasoa, east of the capital, an industrial settlement like nothing the island had seen. Water wheels turned bellows, furnaces smelted iron, crucibles poured bronze into molds for cannon and for bells. Workshops produced muskets, sabers, powder, glass, soap, porcelain, and even sugar pans. A list that made visitors from Mauritius and Réunion blink at the ambition of a queen they had been told was an enemy of innovation. The cost of that innovation was paid in labor commanded by the crown, and the whip could be as present as the carpenter's square. Mantassoa became the symbol of a highland state that would modernize on its own terms, with its own masters, for its own security. The Queen never mistook technical change for submission to foreign counsel. She studied every entreaty that crossed the palace threshold, with the suspicion of a ruler who lived at the edge of empires. The Bourbon Restoration in France sent governors to the Mascarene Islands who spoke of friendship and made charts of the eastern harbors of Madagascar. The court at St. James sent consuls and missionaries, and sometimes gunboats when an affront could be claimed. Traders in Mauritius dreamed aloud of concessions on the east coast, where timber and cattle might be turned to profit and to leverage. Ranavalona listened. She allowed interviews. She agreed to tariffs when they suited her and tore up drafts when they did not. Her sense of sovereignty was a skin without seams. It had no place for missionary schools that refused to bow to palace commands, no patience for consuls who acted like proconsuls, and no trust in treaties that could be rescinded in European capitals after a change of ministry. The Highland Order at the heart of her politics had its own tools to enforce obedience. The ordeal by Tangena, an ancient practice in which a nut from a poisonous tree was mixed into a draught, and the accused forced to swallow, and then to prove innocence by vomiting, had never fully vanished. Under Ranavalona, it was not only revived, it was given a scale that made foreign observers gasp. Village assemblies administered the ordeal at the command of officials. Families submitted to it rather than risk worse punishments. Numbers recorded by missionaries in later years speak of casualties counted in thousands over long stretches of time, a figure likely colored by polemic, and yet consistent with a sovereign's decision to rule through fear as well as through ceremony. In the early years of her reign, the practice's re-emergence was a sign to the Highlands that the Queen was the guardian of the ancestors. After that, it became the lever by which officials held the countryside still when the palace demanded stillness. To see the island as she did, one must stand on the terrace at Annalakely and look east. The forest is a wall, and beyond it the sea is an ever-open door. Ships come to doors with gifts and with ledgers. The gifts dazzle, the ledgers bind. From the day she took the drum and the parasol of office in 1828, Ranavalona understood that the Merina kingdom would survive only if it declined most gifts and rewrote most ledgers. The price would be high in blood, in isolation, and in the anger of nations that were used to having their way in other people's ports. In the first half of her reign, she set the grammar of that refusal. She made ministers fear her. She made villages deliver labor. She made artisans hammer iron into guns on a hillside above a lake. She told missionaries that their creed would not rule her court. She told consuls that their letters would be answered when and how she chose. The bloodier instruments and the full collision with European powers belong to the next part. The stage set here is the Highland court that made a choice to stand alone on a mountain and to look down at every road that led to the sea. The woman who made that choice did so with the calm of a logician and the ferocity of a matriarch. The rest of her story will measure the cost. In the first years after the enthronement Kabari, Ranavalona tested each lever of power to see which answered quickest. The village assemblies obeyed when told to send men for the Queen's work. The regiments marched when drums thudded in the courtyards. The guardians of the royal talismans nodded when she drew the parasol across her shoulder and spoke of the ancestors. The lever that bit deepest into the country was the ordeal. Tangena had existed long before her, a poison nut stirred into a draught that shrank the throat and set the stomach at war with itself, a ritual whose verdict depended upon vomiting 3 chicken skins intact. Under Ranavalona, ordeal became policy. Officials ordered it in property suits and adultery cases, and in quarrels that might once have been settled by fines and lineage. When the Queen wished to frighten a restless quarter, the number of ordeals rose. When she wished to reward a minister, the number fell along the roads he governed. Missionaries and consuls would later write figures that stagger the mind. tens of thousands submitted in some years, and many thousands dead over the course of decades. The exact totals are a ledger no archive can balance with certainty. The lived fact was that fear became a tax paid in bodies. The press of fear fell hardest upon a new flock in the highlands. During Radama's open years, a small church had taken root around the palace schools. Young men and women learned to read the Gospels in Malagasy letters and to sing hymns with harmonies that slipped past the palisades and into rice valleys. They formed prayer bands, NYMPVavaka, that met in courtyards at dusk. They wrote down proverbs and psalms on rough paper and taught children to sound out words letter by letter. Their teachers from the London Missionary Society believed that the discipline of literacy would anchor belief and would bind a modern nation to the Bible as strongly as to any foreign power. The Queen had tolerated this novelty while the succession was uncertain and the barracks still a danger. Once her throne was steady, she measured the schools and the prayers against the authority of the court and found them wanting. In the years around 1835, she drew the line. A royal edict banned the public practice of Christianity and forbade baptisms, preaching, and the teaching of Scripture. The presses that had once printed catechisms were shuttered. The missionaries were ordered to leave the island and, after months of wrangling and last appeals, sailed east toward Mauritius and Cape Town. The small church did not vanish. It went to ground. Students hid Gospels in baskets and clay jars. Families met by night and recited from memory. Then came the arrests. The most famous of those early martyrs was a young woman named Rasalama, taken in the capital and executed outside the walls of Antananarivo in the year 1837. The hill where she died took on a second name from that day. Others followed in 2s and 3s and 10s, flogged, exiled to the coast, or killed by sword or cliff. The Queen did not devote the whole machinery of state to hunting them, for she had wars to fight and roads to build, but she made enough examples that every convert understood the price of stubbornness. Her court was a theater of terror and innovation at once, a combination that astonished foreign visitors. The wooden palaces high on Analamanga, with their lacquered pillars and carved balconies, looked out over workshops that under Jean Laborde's direction turned water and charcoal into an arsenal. At Mantassoa, east of the capital, the industrial village grew to a small city by the late 1840s and 40s. Furnaces roared. A foundry poured bronze for bells and cannon as if to supply a European principality. Muskets came off benches where Malagasy apprentices learned to file locks and to rasp barrels. Powder mills ground saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur in careful proportions. Glassworks drew sheets that shivered into panes for the palace and bottles for the apothecary. Soap kettles boiled. Lofts dried sugar. Porcelain was attempted with more pride than success. The Queen visited in state, her red parasol held high, and announced that the land which once paid in cattle and cloth would now arm itself and clothe itself in its own colors. None of this came without a bill. Vanompoana, the service owed to the sovereign, paid for roads, for stockades along the forest edge, for the iron town at Mantassoa, and for the procession of palanquins and guards that hummed around the court. Men hauled timber and stone up slopes with ropes braced across their chests. Women pounded rice that fed the workers and the regiments. The Queen's officers counted heads with a cold precision that left little room for harvest rhythms or for fever. When a project seized the court's imagination, the weight could be lethal. In the middle of the 1840s, a vast royal hunt was ordered that would sweep the plains for buffalo and demonstrate the abundance promised by an auspicious year. Villages were told to furnish beaters and porters and provisions. The hunt went wrong. Weather turned, supplies failed, and the returns to the highlands were marked by the thud of litters bearing those who had fallen. Foreign accounts tell of thousands dead in that season from exhaustion and hunger. Malagasy chronicles record the grief without numbers, but with a chill reserved for events that people do not forget. Foreign powers pressed from the shore. French and British captains who had once patted Radamar's shoulder now tested Ranavalona's patience with threats and with shells. In the year 1845, ships from both nations appeared off Tamatave, demanding treaty concessions, open ports, and guarantees for their nationals. Shore batteries and highland troops, hardened by constant marches through the forest, beat back probes. The Queen's ministers stalled and defied, and bargained by turns. On another season, ships returned and burned stockades and godowns along the coast. The palace answered with arrests of coastal chiefs suspected of treachery, and with decrees that closed doors tighter than before. The cycle of demand and refusal taught foreigners that the Highland state could bleed and still say no. It taught the court that the sea could punish without conquering. Diplomacy did not vanish in those hard exchanges. It changed tone. The palace controlled every letter that crossed the forest. Foreign consuls in the capital were admitted to audience when it suited the Queen, and were made to wait when it did not. Gifts were accepted and then returned with impeccable courtesy when they came with clauses pinned to them. A few technicians were hired and paid well if they remembered that their skill was the Queen's property. Others were expelled when they presumed to advise. The court invented a language of sovereign disdain that baffled men used to bullying chiefs in small harbors. When a British officer asked why the missionaries could not be tolerated if they taught reading and trades, a minister answered that a school that did not bow to the tomb and the court was a fort built in the mind. Within the palisades, politics moved like weather. The first minister and consort, Rainiharo, held the army in the Queen's confidence through the 1830s and into the 1850s. He brokered discipline between barracks and court, poured oil on faction when needed, and poured fear on towns when commanded. When he died in the early 1850s, his successors did not command with the same blend of soldiers' authority and courtiers' tact. Rivalries among great families sharpened. The Queen, older and more solitary, kept a tighter ring of attendants and insisted on ceremony to mask the strain. Princes of the bare-headed line and of the hair-tufted line, markers of clan and status that any Highland child could read, watched for the moment when the throne would pass and they might rise with it. The capital itself altered in her years in ways that outlasted terror. The Latin alphabet gained a foothold it would never lose. Even after the presses were seized, the habit of writing did not vanish. Clerks in the palace continued to record decrees and tributes in neat Malagasy script that had learned its shapes from missionaries who had sailed away. The Carbery of great occasions began to share space with papers that named specific amounts and dates. The road to the forest thickened with traffic that was not only military. Carts moved iron ingots and muskets from Mantasoa to the hill and returned with cloth and salt. Traders from the west and east coasts, Sakalava and Betsimisaraka, learned to present themselves at court with bundles of hides and honey when before they would have dealt only with coastal factors. The state was drawing the island inward even as it shut the sea out. Death marked the reign in private as well as in public. Those who knew the Queen well spoke of long rages and long silences, of a mind that circled the same suspicions without rest, of a ruler who could quote an ancestor's proverb and then order a punishment that made the proverb into a weapon. She did not retreat from the talismans or from the tombs as years grew heavy. If anything, she leaned closer to both. The great Sampi were displayed with ceremonial gravity. The pilgrimage to Ambohimanga remained the axis of the calendar. When illness came in the late 1850s, she allowed physicians to approach, but never to command. At the end, in the southern winter of 1861, the drums on Analamanga beat the slow measure that told the city the reign had ended. The account books of foreign admiralties and missions wrote their own verdicts then. They tallied lost trade and thwarted treaties and repeated stories of poison ordeals that still freeze the blood. Malagasy Chronicles and Laments wrote another ledger, of a sovereignty preserved at immense cost, of an iron town built in the forest, of roads forced through green walls, and of a queen whose word turned valleys into labor for the hill. Both ledgers hold truth. The population suffered grievously in those decades from the ordeal, and from hard corvée, and from famines that accompany overwork and failed reigns. The kingdom also remained independent at a time when every other great island in that ocean had fallen under a foreign flag. Her death unlocked the box she had kept shut for 33 years. Courtiers lifted a prince to be Radama II, the name a promise to reverse policy and a signal to foreigners that the door would swing open. Treaties were signed. Advisors returned. Concessions were penned that would soon frighten even those who wrote them. The pendulum that had been held at one extreme by the force of a single will swung violently toward the other and broke furniture when it did. But that belongs to another story. The tale told here is of a woman who decided that a kingdom on a mountain could outstare empires if it made itself hard enough, and who proved the point at a price that her people and her enemies both counted in the dark.